Patrol. I think Tom Hanks is in it. Hermione from the Harry Potter series is the main girl character. It's not a really good, powerful book, but like the plot and this whole, because it's so realistic, really.
Is there any truth to it?
I don't think so. However, I think when it was written like 4 years ago, I think some things have actually come to be with like how Google does so much. Keeps you logged in, for instance. Keeps track of your websites. Of course, Facebook does that too. I was shopping for something and I put it in like a cart or whatever online. And then
Yeah, this place is dead during break.
yeah,
Everyone leaves.
yeah, I know. Yeah, when I go into work. Oh, thank you very much, sir. So I'll be working this week and I'll get a lot of stuff done.
Yeah, because it's like a ghost town. I like a ghost town.
Medical students didn't get a break, they're already at our office.
Yeah, yeah. Some students, so between 8th and 9th try, they can take a little bit more time, but between 9th and 10th try, they can't.
There you go. So you can just do forward and back
Okay.
arrow to forward or back. Yeah. It's like
Forward
that.
or back, just the arrows.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And then there's I think this has either one of these have a, if you want to, oh, what happened? It's not up there.
Oh, I'm not sure if it was, sorry.
No, I think it's something here.
Do you have people logged into your laptop?
We have a webinar that we're doing it as part of, but I don't think the one person who's usually from California is usually on. I don't think is going to be on today. She's taking a break too.
So this screen is this. Do you need
Oh,
to?
now I understand
Yeah.
because I need to change.
Yeah. Hang on. This thing here.
Duh.
Yeah.
It's like, why wasn't it? I thought there was something on that. No, it's this. This needs to be changed. Thank you. Ooh, this is tight. Let's move this over here a little bit.
When I teach in the other room, 106, because the heater is right by the window, I typically stand by the window. That's why I kind of immediately went over there and put my stuff. And this
heater.
one is kind of nice because it doesn't have a heater and you don't get too hot, because if they open the windows, then it's like.
I thought the heating was all forced air.
No, there's a baseboard in this one.
In the next
door.
one. Oh, I didn't know that. Didn't know that. I'm always in this room. I always request this room.
This is a nice room. The next room is a little bit bigger.
Oh, like bigger.
Longer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Like here, you can probably get 30 students there. You can get more. Maybe
More,
25,
if they're
30.
more comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the class that just graduated, I don't know when you had them last. So Miranda and who else? Halima was in there. Lori and Gabby, Joel. I don't know if any of them were big time. Michael Robinson.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So they were a large group, and they were too small for this comfortably. Hello, how are you?
Here's a pen. And there's your friend. I'm Debbie.
I'm Anna.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Sorry.
I'm Melinda. Hi. Nice to meet you. Ananda. Ananda? And Anna? Yes.
This is Joel.
I
do.
Yes, yeah, Ananda was helping me, yeah. Good, I just had a little holiday, so I'm fresh.
Did you go somewhere?
Yeah. Where'd you go? Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
I have wanted to go there. For some reason, so I have a photograph of a statue from the Deco era in like 1920s. And I just kind of stole it from an old boyfriend years and years ago. And just all of a sudden, it was in my papers like 2 days ago. And it's from Myrtle Beach. It's right by there. So I was like, oh, I should come South Carolina for my birthday or something. So did you enjoy it? Was it beautiful?
Yeah, that's pretty.
I always forget about these. Thank you.
Do you want, just in case?
So I saw these wise women herbals. I've seen them online.
Responsibilities.
Is that good? Yeah.
They're good. They're nice people too.
And all of them.
Just want to make sure it's recording too. Hope that's out of your way. That'll be okay. Is there another place that's better to put this? We have to keep this here because that's for the webinar. Is there a place that's?
Just remind me if I forget to go over here and.
Yeah, forward and back.
Because I do
This
have
way
a
and this
habit of
way.
doing that. But maybe if I move these and I'm not distracted by them.
Maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes just to see if.
No problem.
Where's your office over there?
Yeah. Do you know where Dr. Connor's office is? Or maybe where it was or?
She was down below on the left.
Yeah, so I'm down,
On the lower level?
down the hall,
On the main level or lower level?
lower level. I don't think there's many faculty that have their offices on the main level
It's more the MIS and
and post-grad. So Dr. Glenn has her office there, but most of us faculty are in the basement.
yeah, we're working with Dr. Glenn. We're bringing Dr. Singh here in October.
Yay, I think I heard that.
Yeah.
Oh, so it is October. Do you have the dates yet?
Yes, actually,
Yeah,
Um,
if you want to forward me or any of the students that info, so we can also send it out to the ILANP. Because I had heard that there might be a naturopathic vitalist gathering here in October. I'm not sure if that's Dr. Edwards Louise would be involved in that. I know they're thinking about having like a naturopathic business seminar in the fall, but I would definitely consider going to students. Maybe.
I know people love going to a thing. I'm going this year too.
Absolutely.
Here's the link.
Oh, yay.
So everyone who's interested, Andre is coming here in October, and here's the link.
Radical cures.
How to obtain them. I think if you do a search
Wow.
on the NUHS page, here it is.
Okay.
So you look, I guess you have to be under academics. Continuing.
education. Yeah. Okay.
That's how you'd sign up for it.
Oh, that is amazing.
Let me send that link to you.
Yeah, I could probably find that too.
Well, let me send it to you. And then, yeah, if you could
Yeah.
share it with,
I will, definitely. I'll get that. I think the ILANP just had their meeting last week, but I think maybe students who might
This
not
is your
be part
email?
of the club.
L. Sorensen.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna send it to Janice too, Georges.
Yeah, yeah.
Who else should I send it to?
Do you know Crystal Sakari? Sakari?
Christine Sakari? No.
I can't remember how to say her last name.
No.
Yeah, you should have had her as a student.
Kristen?
Crystal with a C.
Crystal. No, I
No.
don't have that.
Huh. No. Hey. Oh, that's really exciting. That should be well attended from the student body.
Let's hope. We're putting some money on the line to pay him to come, so hopefully we get break even at
Yeah,
least.
well,
Tim, you're sending that to me too?
Yes.
This registration?
No, okay, Amanda, good. Anyone else I should send it to? Hey, Adrian, you made it. One brave soul.
After finishing everything this week, right? How does it feel to not think about classes?
Feels awesome.
Yes.
Really great.
Sorry.
No, just end of the trimester. Yeah.
Although knowing Adrian, he's probably doing a water fast or something.
No. I did that at the end of March. 1 week water fast.
How was it?
Awesome. It was my
Did you
fourth.
follow a protocol for that or?
No, I'm pretty experienced with water fast now, so I just, go into the fast really good, fruits and veggies, and then I drink a lot of water, 2 or 3 gallons a day, with some Himalayan pink salt for electrolytes, half a teaspoon for each gallon. And then that's it. The most important part is breaking fast.
Do you do the fruits?
I do fruit for like the first part of the day, and then I just do some like cooked veggies, whatever, for the second like dinner, and then that's it. For the
You
second
probably put
day,
Fraser's name on there too, but I don't know if you do anything.
veggie, lighter stuff.
Fraser, poor Fraser. Every time I see him, he's like a
I know.
tornado moving by.
Even when I try to make appointments with them, which is why I just kind of barge into his office.
I know. He did my review last year and we ended up talking about something else. And at the end, he just sort of, well, okay, we'll just, whatever, I don't care. Whatever numbers you want, I don't know, it doesn't matter to me.
I started in 3 days.
I'm not looking for tenure.
Yeah, so I just do really well with them.
Because IMHA have a naturopathic conference in October and
Yeah. And a lot of
Christina
people
Connor and I
struggle
planned
with
it and we're not planning it this year. And we've also decided, or the board has decided to spend money on licensure.
I've never had it.
Oh, and not to have a conference.
Yeah, not to have a conference. Because we made a little money, but it was a lot of work.
We put on a lot of conferences and we've lost money. We had Frederick Schreien's the synthesis repertory guy here. And
Really?
we lost a few thousand. Because he was really expensive.
Yeah.
I do for a little bit, but.
Andre's been reasonable this time. He's been
Something I need to figure out.
I have to be really selective with my CEUs for acupuncture. Illinois acupuncture licenses don't accept a lot, but that would be something.
They won't accept CEUs? They won't accept CEUs?
Illinois acupuncture is only acupuncture with some safety, some ethics.
But they don't.
Oh, and if it goes a little bit out of that, they won't accept it.
They won't accept it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You're right. Maybe it's like
Just needles.
Or relating to, philosophy of treating with needles.
Well, that's something, yeah, that would be something that.
Okay.
Bob,
and I think I sent the link to you for authors.
Oh, good, thank you.
If you're gonna get it, let me know.
Okay. So I'd like to welcome everybody back for Saturday, April 20th, April Illinois Homeopathic Medical Association meeting. And today we have a very special guest star speaker. It's Dr. Linda Sorensen, and she's going to be enlightening us. Well, first of all, I should say that she is a naturopathic physician and faculty and instructor of botanicals at National University here. And she's going to be speaking, as you can see, on botanical therapy and natural medicine and introduction.
Thank you. So before I begin, I was thinking, and Adrian, you can get a copy of this because I sent it to, so you'll get better images, and you all can get a copy if you want. And my email's at the end of this as well. So there's some introductory concepts in here, but I also was thinking about the audience. So I talked about some botanicals that are used a lot in homeopathic medicine because I think knowing a little bit of the differences can help enlighten things. I think it brings a little bit more respect, and also I added a little bit of history. So I am also an acupuncturist and I love Chinese medicine. Not everything in here has Chinese medicine in it, but a lot does. So let's see. Oh,
this arrow. So
You should be able to do this. Yeah,
okay,
that's
it just wasn't
forward,
hard
this is
enough.
back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I made a rough outline, a little bit of history, some discussion on preparations. So herbal preparations are varied. When I think about homeopathics and thinking about dilutions as variations there, I believe the topicals tend to be even in the same dilution. Dilutions of herbal medicine is all across the board. So I brought some samples of some things in to try out. Most of these are tinctures. There were a couple of things I forgot. I have a little bit on the chemistry because chemistry matters with botanical medicine. It's not something that maybe, how to rephrase this, because some people think chemistry is not clinically relevant, but chemistry is important for dosing. Just like knowing the potency is important for dosing, like how you're going to frequent the dose. So I made a little bit of a list. There's a few more that are in the slides, and I'm really open to discussion on a lot of different things. I tend to go off on tangents, and there's a couple of tangent slides in here, but let's talk about some historical aspects first. So when this bullet point says it's one of the oldest methods of healing, we can go back to this grave site in northern Iraq called the Shenadar 4 grave site. And they have found several botanicals that are used in medicine today and have been used. So there's an herb called yarrow, Achillea milfolium. So yarrow was found there, and it's one of my favorite herbs. Now, they're not really sure if that was meant to be healing or if they were just sacred herbs. And I believe that gravesite is 60,000 years old. So, you know, that's one of the first, well, going back and dating it. So botanical medicine has plants and plant parts. So when I say plant parts, I don't think I have a slide devoted to this. It could be flowers, it could be the roots, so it could be the leaves. When you think about lavender, that's mostly the flowers, but you can use the leaves. You wouldn't really use the root of lavender. When you think about ginseng, that's traditionally been the root, but research has found that you can use the whole plant. So they can actually use the leaves and berries of ginseng and keep the plant in the ground and let it live, which is kind of cool because sustainability is really important. You know, we're losing our natural areas to deforestation, climate change, and it's really going to change the world of botanical medicine in the future. I have a little bit about traditional Chinese medicine. I have a little bit about Ayurvedic medicine. I have a slide on a Greek herbalist or physician maybe. I also have a slide on a term that relates to pharmacognosy. Pharmacognosy is basically the beginning of pharmacology. So that's why constituents matter, chemistry matters. But in a way, once those compounds get identified, then they can be used and trademarked. So the term green allopath could be taking a compound and applying it to one specific indication, or the whole plant or plant part. So if I'm using the essential oil of lavender, that's different than lavender tea. So there's pros and cons to that. I think staying with the whole plant and being respectful of tradition, which is why I had a little bit on history here. Herbal trends tend to create more research. So adaptogen, so if you haven't heard of the term adaptogen, it just means something that helps you adapt to the stress of life. There is a three-pronged guideline or definition of adaptogen that goes back to the 60s. And that's something that increases your tolerance to stresses without causing an adverse reaction. Ginseng is an adaptogen. Some people react negatively to ginseng. Licorice is an adaptogen, and some people react negatively to licorice. Exercise, I think, is an adaptogen, really. Good sleep, the right homeopathic remedy, hydration. So this herbal adaptogen It's actually a buzzword. It's adaptogens were thought to be a big moneymaker for the next decade. Now mushrooms are kind of taking over for that. So trends can change things, yeah.
So, question about, you mentioned about, with botanicals, you can do the, the pharmacognosys always want, what's the active ingredient?
Yeah.
And if you're using botanicals, how is it using the whole plant tincture versus using like a single, like a quote, the active ingredient, like the pharmacognosys look at it. In homeopathy, we have like belladonna, we use all the time.
Yeah.
But then atropine, which is considered by the pharmacognosys the main ingredient, I mean,
Yeah.
I can't remember a ton I've used it successful, but belladonna we use successfully all the time. So how is it in technical medicine? How does
So
that,
I think
how
it
is that?
depends on the philosophy of the practitioner. So you're all here, and I'm assuming that means you're really interested in treating the whole person, which means looking at everything. Now, if I'm treating a disease, that's when a compound would be used a little bit more. So I have a slide on berberine, which is part of golden seal, and berberine is the shining botanical to treat diabetes right now. Golden seal never really was, but it is successful. So it's kind of a weird place that botanical medicine is in. And that thing about, might have been on the other slide, chemistry and pharmacognosy. My personal concern is that a lot of that tradition will be lost because the chemistry will be taken up by all kinds of physicians who don't really respect tradition. So is that going to change things? It's going to change availability of the herb, potentially. It depends on what happens with the FDA or whatever country's version of the FDA, the Therapeutic Goods Act in Australia. But I always believe there's going to be people using the whole herb and respecting tradition. It may not be what we really teach about in naturopathic or osteopathic or chiropractic medical school. Medical school for medical doctors will focus on the constituent.
And it's changed things in allopathic medicine because maybe you start off with like a statin made from red rice yeast, but then you don't make any money. So you change the chemical, patent it, and then make billions.
Yeah, so there, well, I have a reference to one of those situations. A couple years ago, I saw some articles that they were looking to make synthetic analogs or kind of modifications of some of the compounds in green tea, for instance. Yeah, that sounds really scary to me. Not necessarily that it produces bad effect in the humans, but
well, that's the thing. Green tea people have been exposed to for millennia.
Yeah.
The new chemical, totally novel.
Yeah.
Who knows what comes.
And because it's a novel compound, somebody can own it. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question, you might not know this, but what about if they're thinking of doing things like that, where the herb is generally regarded as safe?
Yeah.
What are they just going to, grandfather that in this?
No, from what I've seen, there's animal safety studies, and then there's an intervention trial in humans on safety, and then there's an intervention trial on humans for a clinical indication. So the phases of research there, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 tends to be the human intervention trials. Like this morning or last night when I was reviewing some of the turmeric info in here, I had an article, it's not here, but if you want it, I have it somewhere, from 2015 that they used turmeric in healthy people. And some of that was to just look at lab values. Did it change their lab values? So that's how they go about it. Now that costs money, so who's going to pay for that? I'm going into a conspiracy theory here. I mean, some definitely work. I want to work and be integrative with medical doctors, but the pharmaceutical industry owns the insurance. I don't really need to talk about that. And it is a concern, definitely for botanicals. I think we all should pay attention. Yeah. So some random historical slides. Dioscorides was a Greek physician. He is said to have written the first herbal materia medica, but he's also been predated by somebody else that's not as well known. Now his materia medica, thank you, was used for centuries. I have not read very much of it, to be completely honest. Now, one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Eric Yarnell, who's a naturopathic doctor in Seattle that focuses on men's health and urology. So this was just published. They went through, him and his research partner, went through Dioscorides' works on urinary botanicals. So a quote in here, this analysis, their analysis, confirms that Dioscorides was accurate. You know, this is a long time ago, and this was the basis of herbal medicine in that part of the Western European world for centuries. So it was accurate, the nature of the diuretic herbs, and probably other things in that was accurate as well. So I think this would be really interesting to study. I believe it's several volumes. So Dioscorides sort of considered the father of herbal medicine. Now, I also think he had minerals in this too. So it was probably a little bit more like a homeopathic materia medica. Now, in England specifically, John Gerald and Nicholas Culpeper, I'd like to think they set up the basis for Western herbal medicine. So in reality, what we teach in North America, a lot of what we have is found here. Nettles, willows, oaks, things that are commonplace. I don't know Gerald as well, John Gerald as well. I've looked at his herbal. Now it's in Old English writing, so thee and thou and different names and common names. But Culpeper is super interesting, and there's a lot of really fun information about him. So he wasn't a physician. This is back in Britain when it was the Royal Academy of Surgeons, and then there were the barbers. The barbers did, the Royal Academy of Medicine, and the surgeons were the barbers. And then he came and he set up an herb store, a an apothecary, basically. And he fought with basically everybody because they tried to significantly shut him down. He was also super big into astrology. So in some of his writings, he'll say this herb is attributed to Venus. It's super fun. We don't really talk about that energetic. So Venus, who knows Venus? Is anybody born under a Venus sign? So if you're an Aquarius, I think that's Venus, or Libra. Yeah. So loving, you know, balancing. I can't remember what planet Aquarius is, but Culpeper and Gerard, and I don't have a lot of the other Greeks and Roman writings. They would talk about botanicals in terms of temperature, and there's a little bit of that too. So whenever I think about this information and thinking about presenting today, I always go back, and this might have been on a test question when I was a student. What's the coldest homeopathic remedy? Like I don't know them enough to think about that, but I always think about silica and hepar versus some of the really hot, like sulfur's pretty warm, isn't it? So they did botanicals like that too. And so did Chinese medicine. So that's part of that tradition that's really never going to be lost, no matter what happens with the pharmaceutical industry. Now here in the US, Native American healers did not always write things down. People went in, this is the other conspiracy theory, you know, they stole information. We don't have a lot of really good, solid information about how they used herbs. They didn't want to share it, is some of that reasoning that I've been told. And I totally respect that. Some of the books that I have looked at, and this is one of my little pet projects, I like to go back and look, and there's a database of let's see if I can remember what it's called, Native American Ethnobotanical Database, and it's in one of the Michigan universities. All you have to do is put Michigan Native American Ethnobotanical Database, and you can look it up by herb. It talks about baskets, it talks about foods, it talks about the tribes. It's really, really interesting, but it's very it's very short information. Now there is a person, sorry, I have some typos in here. He was not a physician. Samuel Thompson the story is, so who's heard this story? Yeah, so the story is that he had a very, very significant illness as a child. It could have been tuberculosis, it could have been diabetes, and he was cured by a Native American healer. He wanted to be a minister, but after becoming so vitalized from the healing, he became a practitioner, a clinician. And really what he did is he taught. He went to churches and he had his own little school. I call it Thomsonian medicine, but it does overlap with this term here, physiomedical medicine. Physiotherapist is sometimes how it's described. Samuel Thompson was thrown in jail a few times, but he made a profound influence. Let's see, I don't know if this is a homeopathic remedy. I should have checked. Lobelia?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So
There's different
Lobelia.
species, but there's
Yeah.
Inflata and there's.
So he's the one who used Inflata a lot, and this is called Indian pukeweed. So we have this theory in naturopathic medicine that you need to have a discharge, or you could say a detox, but you need to get those emotions out or get the discharge out. And lobelia in high amounts is an emetic. And
It's Indian tobacco, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so various common names, same plant. We have it growing around here, but different species. So which species do you use more in remedies?
Inflata is the main one. There's others.
Lobelia
Arenas
syphiliticum.
or something. For cancer.
Okay.
A couple species that we use.
Yeah, so Samuel Thompson, at least herbally, was really big into that plant. So one of the stories about him being arrested and thrown in jail is somebody had GI conditions and he gave him lobelia, and of course he threw up. But the patient actually recovered. So he was a huge influence. Some of his formulas are still available today. They've been bought by lots of people. Samuel Thompson's lineage is thought to go down. There is a herbalist physician. Let's see if I can remember the dates. So mid-1900s, I think he passed away in the 80s. John Christopher, and his son is still alive. His son is David Christopher. And his son David will say, oh, they're not Samuel Thompson's formulas, but they are super close. And Nature's Way, which is a company that's been around and owned by lots of parent companies. Right now, Nature's Way is owned by a German company. Some of their formulas are based in the old Samuel Thompson. So there used to be a formula called bone, tissues and cartilage or something like that, and it was just about MSK support and healing, and it was really, really unique, but now it has a different name and it's slightly changed. The eclectic physician, so this image of lots of males in suits were the eclectic physicians, and they're really centered in the Midwest. This is actually the Midwestern naturopathic tradition, sort of comes from them. This guy, oh, we can't really see him very well. This guy over here is John Scudder. John Scudder had two books, specific diagnosis and then specific medications. So his specific diagnosis was, when I look at it, it's like, oh, the tongue looks like this. It doesn't really go into personality type like the mind and body. The triad of homeopathy, but when I look at his books, I actually think it's very much like homeopathy. And there are people, including one of the Thomsonian medicine people, will say the eclectic physicians actually stole from the homeopaths, but they also took from Native Americans. So the eclectics were some of the first physicians that wrote about Native American medicine, that created their own herbal products. Many writings. They were prolific. So the Lloyd Library is this library and museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, and right now they have an exhibit on historical artifacts of cannabis. So Adrienne, you had commented on that.
Oh, that's the one.
Yeah. So the Lloyd Library is the repository of the eclectic writings, and you can go down there and visit. It's open. You can't really look at all the books because they're really rare and really old, but which now is my little cue to, I have, this is a reprint, and it's the only one I actually own. And I chose this one because it must pull out. But it's so fascinating. Like, here's rhubarb right here. And this does have some minerals in it. I don't think it reads like a homeopathic book at all. Here's Ignatia though. So if you want to kind of compare the very beginnings of herbal medicine in the US and kind of see if there's overlap with remedies, I would recommend one of these. Yeah, Francine.
You know, in homeopathy, we have a very specific trajectory of how to select a substance. So we have rubrics.
Yes.
That give us, you know, the puzzle pieces and
Yes.
look at a group of remedies. Okay. I have been confused in reading herbal things with all the things that it can quote do.
Yeah. Herbs are.
How, unless you study herbal medicine specifically, and even in homeopathy, you're not really required to memorize the substances. All you have to do is the technique that kind of gets you in the ballpark of the substance, and then you can read about it.
Yeah.
How do you get into the ballpark of a herbal substance?
It's really difficult and it takes practice. Yeah, I would say we don't have anything like that, especially in Western herbal medicine. The eclectics came close, like that Dr. Scudder talking about using, I can't remember which botanical, you know, for a really red tongue with a rapid pulse, you know, so.
There's no way to like look up herbal substances that have been used for a red tongue with a rapid pulse.
Oh, thank you for asking, because now that's going to lead into my other books. There's really not, but I grabbed the smallest book of this author that I had. Matthew Wood is an herbalist, so I have he's a traditional herbalist, so he's a little bit more like Samuel Thompson and less like physician. His writings are amazing, and his last book is I can't remember what he called it, was basically that. It's looking up an herb, looking at the symptom and seeing all the botanicals that have been reported. So he's a really good historian. This is called The Practice of Traditional Western Herbal Medicine, Basic Doctrine, Energetics, and Classification. So this is sort of the beginning book for that. I cannot remember what the other book is called, but if you remind me, I can bring it in and show you sometime.
Yes, there's a book of herbal wisdom.
The book of herbal wisdom is amazing. Yeah. That's my favorite book of his. It doesn't have a lot of herbs. It has like 25 in great detail.
He also has he has like a book of like old world herbs.
Yeah.
I think that's more specific. Book of New World herbs.
Yeah, the Old World book of Matthew Wood is quite larger because there's more writing on European botanicals. The New World is smaller and the sections are smaller. And then he did this last one, which is sort of like a repertory, basically. You know, you look up things. It doesn't tell you a lot about the therapy, so you're actually meant to use his books together. But he says he was trained as a homeopathic clinician, and it definitely shows in his writings. So, yeah.
There were homeopathic physicians in history who borrowed a lot from the eclectic tradition too, and especially in treating cancer patients. I mean, Dr. St. Allen webinars were doing treatment of cancer patients and looking at like Eli Jones.
Oh, yeah.
He used homeopathy, but he used a lot of herbal tinctures, phytoacca and
Okay.
scrofularia and things like that.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the indications were purely clinical. Oh, glands, swollen glands, okay, you use it.
Yeah.
Breast
Yes.
tumor, you use phytoacca. You know, there weren't a lot of, it wasn't individualized that much. There were a couple things maybe.
Yeah.
Burnett prescribed like that a lot too. He would prescribe just on the similarity of the organ. And
Yeah, the
eclectics. From the eclectic.
We're eclectic because they just used what was the most appropriate. It didn't matter what tradition it was from. They used some homeopathy, they used some drugs. I think some did at least minor surgery quite a bit. So but I just really love their herbal writings. They have beautiful writings on hawthorn. Now their writings on cocaine are not really feasibly used in medicine anymore, so some of their writings were not as specific, but hawthorn has not changed a bit, except we have more an expanded knowledge of it. Yeah, I love the eclectics. Matthew Wood is fairly good on the eclectics, but what he does is everybody, including the people who are not physician level. Oh, this person talked about it in a lecture once, and he'll put it in his writings. There is an herbalist who often writes about the eclectic with modern interpretation, and his name is David Winston, and he has a lot of writings too, but not as detailed as Matt. So this goes back to our other, this ties into this concept of how to dose and how is this going to change. I like to use this term traditional herbalism because that's a tradition of any kind of practitioner using ideally fresh. I really like fresh herbs, but you actually pick it yourself. A lot of traditional herbalists go out and forage, basically. Some of them grow, some of them buy. So we have lots of online retailers now. So Mountain Rose Herbs is this online retailer for a ton of herbal stuff. You can buy big bulks of dried herbs, elderberry, and make elderberry syrup, and you don't have to go out and forage for it. But this is about seeing what is presented to you. So it's a little bit different than, say, treating insomnia or nausea. It's like this patient that is also having palpitations has insomnia. So that changes the herbal treatment. Modern, so when I say modern, I mean like Matthew Wood's era. There is also, if you ever want to go out to Michigan, there's an amazing herbalist who's incredibly funny. Jim McDonald, he tells just these fabulous stories. Not as clinically, but he does great herb walks. They have an approach to taking this historical Greek, European, and a little bit of TCM energetics, and they call it the tissue states. Is your tissue flaccid? Is your tissue tight? Do you need an astringent for a flaccid tissue? What's your mood like? And it's basically a 4-system model. Like the humors, for instance. I use the humors in a lot of that. So incorporating other traditions is there. Now that's compared, so I have a couple of terms on this last bullet point. Evidence-based botanical medicine is the phrase that's used now. So, you know, where's the research? Rational herbalism was the phrase used in the 80s. Phytotherapy was the phrase used in the 90s. This is based on what the compounds are. So I do have a little bit of compounds. I like putting it all together. Research is great. It misses a lot, but it helps me show to people that this actually works. You know, at least it works for some things. Herbal actions. So some of you, I think specifically Lisa in the back, might have a copy of this, and I think I have enough. And there's also herbal actions are very similar to pharmacological actions. This is what I use in my class. They're based on what happens to physiology, to the tissues. So you can take a look at this, and I'm not going to go over the whole list. But just to go back to Francine's question, well, my default case is always diabetes in classes, but we can use ulcerations. So the patient has an ulcer, so I need something to heal the tissues. I might need something that decreases blood, so styptic. So styptic is an action. I always go back to back in the 70s or something, the little styptic wands, right? You could put when men and women were shaving and they nicked themselves. And I think that was a mineral specifically, but herbal astringents, green tea is styptic, but its primary action is astringent. So an astringent astringes by, it actually binds nitrogenous compounds, so the proteins of the skin. So an astringent could bring, like if you think about wounds, induce a little bit of closure. And then there's another term up there, demulcent. A demulcent is the weirdest term ever. I don't know where it came from. I've looked over the years. Who made this up? Demulcents are kind of slimy. So the herbalist Jim McDonald's references a term called slimaceous. They tend to be carbohydrates like mucilaginous compounds, and they create a barrier. Oatmeal is a demulcent. So if you've made oatmeal and you see how kind of sticky it is, especially once you leave it in the pan, so you boiled it and maybe you ate a little bit and you forgot about it. So you could use the two together, and that's one of the beauties of herbal medicine is combining. Yeah.
It's something like,
Comfrey has demulcent activity, absolutely. Yeah.
mucilaginous, I know the.
Yeah. Comfrey, marshmallow, slippery elm, aloe, licorice, a little bit of demulcent too. Yeah. A couple more. Yep. Yep. Aloe vera gel. If you're using too much of the green part of the aloe, just inside a microscopic layer on the green part is where the laxative action is. Yeah. Yeah. So herbal actions, that's how people use herbs a lot. It's like an astringent is indicated, which astringent is going to be the best for you? Which astringent is widely available? Green tea is widely available. Witch hazel is widely available. It's a common astringent. Around here, since it's springtime, okay, this is April 20th, 420. I saw that this morning. So in about a week and a half to 2 weeks, there'll be these little pink flowers popping up in the forest preserves. That's a geranium, and Geranium maculatum is a really, really good astringent, but it's the root. So you can't really dig up the roots in a forest preserve. So astringent, demulcent. I also like the term that's not on here, carminative. Carminative is a weird term as well and has lots of different references, but carminatives are slightly moving to the GI, so they're antispasmodic. The basic definition of a carminative is expels gas. Yeah.
What's the difference between the plain type and the bold type?
Oh, so the bold type was for my classes. I left it like this because the bold type I feel is unique to herbs or food. Like a demulcent, the demulcents used in pharmacy are from plants. They're from seaweeds. So they use sodium alginate in pharmacy, which is derived from seaweeds. Seaweeds can be demulcents as well. Most demulcents are carbohydrates. Now a stimulant is also involved. Now I will, I have a particular thing about a couple of these actions, so I will kind of jump into that. At the bottom of this page, stimulant and tonic. These are really, really general terms, right? You know, in the eclectic herbal medicine world, a stimulant wasn't just a mental stimulant like coffee and cocaine. It was something that stimulated an organ or an organ system. So if I have a gastric stimulant, eventually it's going to have a laxative effect. That sort of makes sense. It makes everything move more. If I have a cardiovascular or a circulatory stimulant, I might also sweat. So it has an effect down the road. But stimulants right now in the modern world are coffee, right? Mental stimulants, you know, drugs and things like that. Tonic is sort of the same way. I encourage people to think about tonics, and tonic is a word that gets thrown out a ton in herbal medicine. Dr. Eric Yarnell, who I just referenced, He likes to say a tonic usually means it's safe. But an adaptogen could be a tonic. Like some people can take licorice and they feel great, right? Or like I said, some people could sleep well and they feel great. It's like energizing, it supports, it's like a supplement. But in the herbal world, in the herbal writings, an astringent herb like witch hazel tonifies the epithelium if there's discharges. If I continue to apply that witch hazel when there's no discharges, it's actually going to start irritating the tissue, and that's not tonic. So I encourage my students to think, when you see this term, it's not very medical, it's not hardcore, but you have to think, what is that actually telling you? Where does this botanical work? Is this a temporary tonic in a disease state, or is this a tonic to the whole person? Like for some people, caffeine is a stimulant, it's tonic, right? So, you know, it's kind of general and vague, but that's how we classify herbs. Every system will use something like this. In Chinese medicine, they're grouped by what organ they treat in Chinese medicine and then how hot or cool it is. So ginseng is warm. Astragalus is a little cooler. Most of the cold things in Chinese medicine are actually minerals. Rhubarb is cold, but the groupings of the organ system, like say spleen qi, that's sort of looking at what's happening with the pathology. Rising, descending, moving is really big in Chinese medicine. If somebody had hypertension, you wouldn't give them a rising herb for too long. Orange peels rise. So they use 3 or 4 different citrus peels in Chinese medicine, and hypertension could be made worse by that. There's an herb called blupleurum that can make blood pressure worse because it rises. Now, astragalus rises, but it's not as dangerous for our blood pressure because it clarifies the thought. So they have weird ways of using some of the same categorization, if that makes sense. Yeah, this is a weird topic. So if you have questions, please ask.
Well, I'm just thinking of a specific, I guess for hibiscus. I was told that it can lower blood pressure, and it's very expensive to buy hibiscus tea, but if you go to the Spanish markets, it's called something else.
Yep.
And you can buy a big bag of it for a lot less.
Roselle or sorrel at the stores, it's got a few different common names. Yeah.
It's, I'll think of the name.
Or flower de
Dr.
jicama,
Connor told me about it.
because it is the flower of Jamaica.
There's a name for it.
Yeah, hibiscus has several common names. Hibiscus is the scientific name. Hibiscus is tart and astringent and cooling. So cooling tends to be good for inflammation and blood pressure. Not everybody with high blood pressure is hot. This kind of stereotype of a type A personality with a red face, maybe an alcoholic, that's somebody that would benefit from hibiscus. Yeah, so sometimes putting different actions. So, and this goes back to the other discussion, one herb can have many different actions. So I always like to think if you can have one herb treat a patient with several different problems, that's what you should use. Because it's simpler, and that's actually what it's called. It's called a simple versus a compound, or I like to say formula, which is multiple herbs together.
There's a problem with the word physiology. When you go through medical school, physiology is just chemistry reactions, but this physiology is response of the organism.
Yeah.
More descriptive and qualitative.
Yep, definitely. It's really looking out the tissues, the organ, and what you can actually see and feel. Now, I will have to say that I think galactagogue, that's an action that I think is based a little bit on chemistry and enzymes. So we think the lactogogues, by promoting milk production, are increasing prolactin. So there could be an enzyme that it works on. We know that licorice supports the adrenals or your body by increasing cortisol, and we know exactly where that's at. So there is an overlap, but once you get closer into enzymes, and I love enzymes, I teach them a lot in my class. I like hormones, and I like making sure my students are at least aware of some of that, and I have one of the slides in here. You do get super specific, and I will associate, this is my personal opinion, that functional medicine is looking at enzymes and stopping them and inducing them and changing them. Good morning. Does that make sense? Now, functional medicine is, I don't know the definition of that right now. You know, it's very much based in chemistry, and it's obviously not going away. So this is an interesting thing to think about. I don't have a good foundation of Ayurvedic energetics. Ayurvedic herbs have an energy before you eat it and after you eat it. Yeah, Lisa knows them. They're very complex. We have some books in the library on Ayurvedic herbs. I've just had a hard time memorizing them. But I wanted to start with the class I tend to like a little bit, bitter herbs. So bitters were associated with poisons because, so you probably have a copy of this. Bitter herbs tend to be a chemistry class called alkaloids. And alkaloids are found in belladonna, right? The plant belladonna. Alkaloids are also found in reptiles and fish. They didn't know that when they put alkaloids as a class. Coffee and golden seal contain alkaloids. These two, gentian and picoriza, I do have a sample of gentiana, which I suppose I should grab right now. Now, Peruvian bark, you know, it's not quite as bitter, but it's added to a lot of bitter mixtures because of the quinine, which INE tends to mean that it's an alkaloid. So, you know, most alkaloids and most bitter botanicals are actually amazing for us in small quantities. So let's see, I think it was Jim McDonald. I steal this, and I'm really open when I completely stole it. The bitter deficiency syndrome. American diet is full of sweet. You know, even if you just eat French fries and cheese, it's pretty sweet. So coffee is the major source of bitters in the American diet, and coffee is really resourced. But cabbage has a pungent bitter to it. The plants in the cabbage family, the plants in the lettuce family, like romaine, is going to be more bitter than iceberg. And then if you went and go forage lettuce, it's going to be very bitter, the wild lettuce. What I have is Gentiana lutea. Now, these are expired tinctures from our clinic for the most part. And I have not tested this one for a while. So if you don't have water, you don't have to try it. You don't, of course, some people will recognize the little drop you put on your hand. Oh, yeah.
Do you have water?
What?
Do you have water?
I have water. I quoted one of my students years ago. They call it, because I bring samples, they call these root vodka. Sometimes they get sweeter over the years, and sometimes they get more bitter, or sometimes they go bad. This is pretty consistent. Gentiana lutea is probably the main bitter botanical used in herbal medicine right now. So try it if you want to. So bitters.
What is it used for?
Mostly for GI. So bitters are gastric stimulants. So by tasting this, we have taste receptors. I don't know where I have that little tidbit in here. You don't have to taste the bitter compound. There are receptors in the small intestine that respond to bitter compounds. You can take it in a capsule. But when you taste it, it actually sends signals, and you start to have like, it's not normal physiology. which is why this is a little bit different. It's not the, I just taught this a few weeks ago in classes, it's not the cephalic phase of digestion where you're starting to salivate, but it starts to induce salivation, you know, because it's so bitter, your body's like, get this out now, let's make salivation. And because that signal has been created in your brain, then your stomach starts to have a little bit more acid. And then eventually, so if you take bitters before you eat, you have more digestive enzymes, and then ideally you would have a better gallbladder contraction too. Initially, this is something that's talked about in various old traditional medicine, bitters will increase the appetite. So if somebody's been really sick, maybe cancer or chronic viral infection, a bitter should help them eat a little bit more. But over months to years, especially if we get more information on that bitter taste receptor in the small intestine, it should normalize appetite if people do not have the, like, how many of you are up on the, and I'm not up on this even though I should be, adiponectin, leptin, ghrelin, this hunger satiation hormone pathway that's incredibly confusing. So some people, their hormones for appetite, they just don't work as well, so they're always hungry. So the more, this is research based, the model with using bitter botanicals is over time that their hormones should normalize for that. Now these are all different. Gentiana, in the Western herbal tradition, this specific form, Gentiana lutea, even though it's from Europe, the mountains of Europe, we use it for digestion, but the Chinese Gentiana is used for hepatitis, which affects digestion, right? If you think about a hepatitis A presentation. Picaryza is used in India, and then golden seal is used as an antimicrobial a lot. Now golden seal is used for a lot more. So these are difficult to use with patients. They don't have to be tasted, but they're fun. Yeah.
Gentiana lutea and homeopathy, it's known if there are cases of use in anaphylaxis.
Really?
Especially with like swelling, but especially with breathing difficulties in anaphylactic reaction.
Oh, that's amazing.
I've used it once or twice, I've seen it helpful. And hydrastis is one of our main remedies for people with cancer, cachexia, to increase appetite, and that definitely found it to be useful. So we use it more as a GI, but also infections and kind of like
yeah, I remember that from.
I've actually used it more lately for
okay.
cachexia and appetite stimulation.
I just.
Yeah.
Remedies might be easier to use than some of the botanicals. If I took, let's say, 5 milliliters of that tincture, because it's so bitter, it will cause a little bit of irritation. So because it induces more stomach acid, that can be irritating to many people. Over time, it tends to help. So as you told that story, a student had tried Gentiana kind of on his own just to experience it, and he didn't have an anaphylaxis response, but definitely had a reaction to it. So it was kind of an interesting overlap there. So this is one of my favorite energetics because it starts in one place, but it does affect the majority of the GI tract. So I use the sprays bitter. Cholagogues, which is increasing bile output, is basically the same. But bitter can be bitter foods too. I made this table a couple of years ago just to compare bitters in Western, Chinese, and Ayurveda. So Picaryza, that herb, which I haven't had a sample of for many years, and I think it's the most bitter on this list, Gentiana. And this is the constituent. Gentiana is used in bitters used in alcoholic preparations. So Angostura bitters tend to have a little bit of Gentiana in it. Taraxacum is dandelion, and Artemisia, that's the wormwood, mugwort family. Now, Artemisias are a little bit different. Most bitter botanicals are cold, and over time, theoretically, they're anti-inflammatory too, because if you think about the cardinal signs of inflammation, heat is one of them. Now, artemisias, some of them can be warm and cold. Chinese medicine has a whole bunch of artemisias, but the ones used in Western medicine are cold. Coptis is like golden seal. They use it a lot for digestive issues. So if you compare this, the actions here, this like golden seal compound or herb, it has the most berberine than any other herb that's been reported right now. Drains down and is really good for a dysentery-like presentation. Picoriza is compared to milk thistle, which is really interesting, but it's very, very bitter. So just to put those in. And then I made this slide the other day because Easter is tomorrow, and bitter herbs are not important to Easter, but they're important for Passover. So I am not of that faith, and I've never experienced that tradition, but horehound is often referenced. So horehound is this weird herb that is not very popular, but it's increasing in sales, and it's much stronger than thyme or oregano. So if anybody's used oregano or played around with oregano essential oils, I would say horehound is definitely more bitter. A student made a tincture many years ago, and she said it was the worst thing she ever tasted. That was IMHA, or what does she go by now? Melanie. Yeah, yeah. That was really interesting. Yarrow, as I mentioned, was in that gravesite. Chamomile and peppermint do have bitter action underneath that nice flavor that they have. So one herb can have several different attributes to it. And then I have this slide that I just put in a combination. I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I've not put it down. This is the first time I put it down like this. Herbals can be moving, so they can make a tissue work a little bit more, or they can calm a tissue down. So that's like a stimulant would be more moving, and then a relaxing would be more calming. So bitters are more moving, lymphagogue. Amenagogue is about bringing on the menses. Carminative are antispasmodics, but because they relax the intestines, so the definition is helps expel gas. So if you're expelling something that's moving, and of course laxative is pretty specific. Now antispasmodic in this case for me is about uterine antispasmodic. I guess I should clarify that. We talked about demulcent, talked a little bit about adaptogen, tonic depending on what's going on. I actually would put diaphoretic in this category as well, so making you sweat. And I think that could be something to think about with indications. So a little bit on actions. I'm probably taking up much more time than I should be. Okay. Because now the next round of slides are about preparations. And I think I have 6 or 7 here. I like tinctures. And I like tablets. I will have to say over the years, I am not compliant with my own tinctures. I made this really good tincture formula for a patient of mine, and then I decided to make a bottle for myself, and I've taken it like twice. And that was about 3 weeks ago. So I do find that a lot of people are more, it's hard to take something that might not be palatable. This was not a bad tasting tincture. If you're in the habit of drinking teas are really good for flowers, leaves, things that are rich in aromatic essential oils. Tannins, so those astringent tannins, witch hazel is fairly good in a tea. Boiling roots, barks like cinnamon, and harder plant barks like nutmeg, which is part of a seed. You need to boil that for several minutes. The decoction is the term used for that. Decoctions will extract more chemistry from that. So traditional Chinese medicine uses decoctions of ginseng, whereas in Western medicine, we almost always either use a standardized extract or a tincture. But I still like using just like a capsule or a tablet from the retail store. The majority there is just going to be 500 milligrams of dried herb. I like to call it the crude herb because it's just been dried. Sometimes there can be adulteration. So if you're buying products from Amazon, or you know people who are, make sure that there's either a reputation of the company and somebody's looked at them, because Amazon is now being targeted because it's like the world's shopping mall or something like that. Powders are really hard to identify once they're in powder. They don't smell the same, they don't look the same, they lack the vitality of a live plant. So a tea, a decoction, you can just go out and pick and dig, or making an alcoholic extract. I didn't make a slide on this, but a tincture folk method is to just take an herb. So this is gonna be my jar. And let's say I have a cup of dried herb in a canning jar. And then I just make sure alcohol, so ETOH for alcohol, covers it. Now, if it's a dried herb, it's going to soak up the alcohol and I need to add more alcohol the next day. So this is the folk method because it doesn't involve calculations. If you want more specific, there are several calculations about weighing the herb, especially if it's dried, it works, and then calculating the volume, and then you kind of do some, like you might have done in organic or general chemistry class. But I find that this folk method of making a tincture makes really, really strong tinctures. And I do this a lot with fresh herbs. So the dried herb will soak up the alcohol. The fresh herb is not as strong, but I just like them. For me, seeing that live plant is really important. I make tinctures of an herb called motherwort, which is Leonoris cardiaca. I don't know if that's used. I can't say I've ever looked it up in the repertories or Materia Medicas. I make something of motherwort almost every summer. I've had patients I give it to. St. John's wort is another one I do the folk method with a lot, and sometimes we'll just do it for classes, or I'll make samples. I'm like little teeny tiny jars, and I end up with a half of a tincture bottle just to bring to class, and then I forget. But it's a good way to preserve. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I have another slide on the standardized extracts, and injections are done in some states, herbal injections. Turmeric has been injected, licorice has been injected. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of, but I know that there's definitely more. So they are purchased from basically a European pharmacology company because they're not necessarily approved by the FDA. So, but some people are having really good success with them, especially curcuma, turmeric, and cancer.
Did you say alcohol you put in? Is it vodka? Is it Everclear?
I use vodka now. I used to exclusively use Everclear, but because those tinctures taste really, really, really bad and need to be diluted, I just use vodka. Now vodka, let's see. Yes, it's on this slide. Awesome. Vodka is what? 80 proof, which means it's 40% alcohol and the rest is water. Yeah, so Everclear is mostly alcohol. There are books, and we have some in the library, and I might have some references. They're all a little different. They'll say this herb, when it's dried, you use this percentage of alcohol. So if you've had Everclear, you add water to create that percentage. But this is actually why I like the folk method, and it's, I will have to say, it's sort of the lazy herbalist way of doing it. I'm gonna have to come up with a good name for that, but
Does it macerate the plant at all, or just take the leaves and throw them in there?
you should macerate that. You can cut it up really small. If you want to dry it, you could run it through a grinder. The surface area should make a difference. I don't always do that. I will take the plant, I'll take the leaves off, I'll kind of rip it up, and that keeps me in contact with the plant. And then I can, my whole kitchen smells and kind of gets really dirty, but sometimes I don't do anything to it, and I'll even put the stems in there. Yeah.
You have to be careful, because I mean, let's say you're taking like conium, if you're doing a tincture of conium. I mean,
yeah, I recommend only using very, very safe herbs for this. Yeah, so conium is abundant in this region too. Conium, so water hemlock is a little bit more abundant, and that's Cucutia, I think. Thank you. in the early springtime or maybe mid-springtime. So water hemlock and elderberry leaves actually look similar. And so once they grow, they look completely different, but there have been people that confuse them. Yeah, now luckily elderberry leaves are not used in medicine, it's the berries. But there is always a concern. Every year, the botany groups that I follow make a big deal about that. The water hemlock is the most poisonous plant we have in this environment. I have a dog. We go out in nature all the time. She takes nips of the plants, and every now and then when I see it, I'm like, okay, you're not going to nip that, because it literally does grow all over. This is a wetland, and it likes water. Yeah, so you should, I could just show you pictures of herbs and be happy about that. Learning to identify herbs is not too difficult, but what I encourage my students to do is where are you gonna practice? What are you gonna do? Where's that tradition of herbal medicine? So Midwest herbs are very different than the herbs in Seattle. You know, getting a sense of what grows there. Is there a Native American reference you can look at, and then go out and be in nature, because being in nature is kind of like an adaptogen as well. It's not as adaptogenic when your brain is engaged and trying to learn how to identify things, but after a while, you definitely get that. So a little bit more about tinctures. Hydroalcoholic, so the vodka Everclear is a little bit less hydro, a little bit less water. But the hydroalcoholic extracts is what PubMed and research uses as their term. They hardly ever use the term tincture. So they're extracts. Now these are defined as a ratio. So I'm not sure, I do have a ratio on this gentiana, and it is a 1:3. So this is a Wise Woman Herbals, that's a company in Oregon. They make really good tinctures. The ratio is an indicator of strength, and it is 1 part herb to the solvent. So a tincture is almost always alcohol. You can actually say glycerit, but you can also say glycerin tincture, because tincture really just means extract. It doesn't exclusively refer to alcohol, but most people will just assume, and that's the way I assume it as well. In Britain, they used a 1:5, so 5 parts of a solvent to 1 part of an herb. So Wise Women's are a little bit stronger. I have a licorice solid extract that is much stronger. It has 4 parts of the herb to 1 part of a solvent, and I think that solvent is glycerin, so it's very sweet. So it tells you how strong it is. When I do calculate these folk method tinctures that I make, so every now and then I do measure, and I do small ones because I actually measure out, I weigh my alcohol, which is hard to do in my little tiny scales. They end up being like a 1:3 to a 1:4. So they end up being quite strong. As long, and they're safe to do with safe herbs, as long as the herb is covered, because when the herb pops out, then it's going to get oxidative stress. And that won't harm the tincture if it's alcohol. If you're extracting something in olive oil and there's a little bit of an herb popping out, it can actually start to have a fungal infection and your whole product could be damaged. So we use this tincture ratio almost exclusively for alcoholic tinctures though. Chinese has herbal granules. We have these in our clinic over here. They're very, very strong. They do have, often they have a little bit of rice in them just as a solidifying thing.
And the 1:4 or something, is that up by volume or by weight?
That's the hard part. If I really wanted to calculate that, so it's by weight and then by volume, and then there's 2 or 3 different calculations to end up, but I prefer actually just to use it all by weight. But to weigh alcohol, you know, if I was to mass produce, you can't really weigh that much alcohol in a lot of the scales that home herbalists use, or even the small herbal companies. So there is a couple of books, the herb books that will tell you what percentage of alcohol to use also have various calculations. So I've seen like 2 or 3. And I've only done one, and I will have to say I get a little bit flummoxed by trying to do the calculations, but if you like math, I would encourage you to check it out and do that. Does anybody like math in here?
I don't mind it. It's not my favorite, but I was a finance major undergrad, so I'm good at it.
Yeah, we should have you do some. Yeah.
Make some spreadsheets.
Yeah, there actually are some spreadsheets that some people make. Maceration is the soaking. So with this folk method of tincture, this is my observation that at least 3 weeks soaking, macerating. A lot of people do a whole moon cycle. I actually have some St. John's wort in tincture from last year, though. I just haven't strained it out yet because I don't really have a use for it. So sometimes I just let it soak. You can also use vinegar. So glycerin and vinegar for people that don't tolerate alcohol, because you can never completely burn off all the alcohol, but just a few drops tends to be okay. Glycerin is very, very sweet, so it's suitable for children. When I make glycerits, I've been adding rice vinegar to thin it because glycerin is really sweet and sticky. And this is holy basil with rice vinegar added. Some students have told me they don't like the vinegar quality. Sometimes I can taste it and sometimes I can't. I don't like diluting glycerin with water. Glycerin won't extract as much as alcohol will. So that's why tinctures are kind of the standard. But glycerin, great for kids, great at night. Works for a lot of aromatic plants, doesn't work for some things.
What do you say great at night?
I think because that sweet taste is kind of comforting and tonic. Yeah, yeah. Vinegar, I've only done a couple of vinegars with herbs. A student many, many years ago, trying to remember who that was. Maybe that was Ina. No, I remember who this was. I don't remember her name though. But you might remember her. You might remember her. Juanita, Black woman from Europe, right? So she ground up milk thistle seeds and soaked them in apple cider vinegar because she didn't do alcohol at all. And it was amazing. We just tried a little bit and there was like an energy to it. And some of that was the vinegar and some of that was definitely the milk thistle. And some of that was probably Juanita. So maceration is soaking. Percolation is not something I've actually done successful. It is soaking for a very short amount of time and using gravity, not boiling it like a percolator coffee machine, but gravity through a filter. And you soak the material, which is usually dried things like peppermint. Peppermint is supposed to be really good in percolation. So you soak it in alcohol like overnight, and then as you filter it, you add more alcohol and it displaces the alcohol that's been soaked. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and they are thought to be very, very strong. And if you can get this done and do it successfully, it is supposed to be a very easy system. You just need a little bit more equipment. So these are the two types for basically tincture making. Tincture ratios. So I wanted to talk a little bit about aconite, and aconite is a low dose botanical and its ratio is like really big most of the time.
It's toxic.
Yes. So all the nightshades, belladonna, datura, hyoscyamus, tend to be pretty low dose as well. Pulsatilla can be a little bit different. So ratios maybe making a difference. So the benefits of a tincture is that it's fairly shelf stable. A good 5 years. I have tinctures that are older than 5 years, and I find if it's just sitting, it'll be fine. But if I'm if I'm opening them twice a trimester, which means possibly 6 times a year, and then closing them again, that opening and closing, so the more you open and close it, the more it's exposed to the elements. So it does go bad. They also should be stored in brown bottles to reduce the light hitting them. But tinctures are really good if something is fat soluble. So turmeric, The ginseng is good in a tincture. So I think I have a slide on a little bit of that. Tinctures don't get bugs. Marshmallow root, which is a really common thing to have in a tea, works really nice in a tea or a decoction. Insects love to eat marshmallow roots because it's basically like a starch. It's different than the marshmallow candy, but bless you. And definitely makes a difference here. So dried herbs can lose their strength. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna ask you about, you know, cooking that food, I have tons and tons of ingredients. Tons. And, you know, they tell you if it's this kind, you 6 months and you have to get another fresh one or
Yeah.
whatever. But if a person is, let's say has a garden. And is, you know, growing herbs and want to store the herbs in the future to make a tincture or do something with it. Are there rules about how to dry it? Are there rules about freezing it or?
Some plants do better with some things. So when I go out and harvest or grow, I usually just take the stuff above the ground. So roots should ideally be dried, but cut before they're dried, because once they dry, they're hard to get cut. Part above the ground, like leaves and flowers, it doesn't necessarily matter. Some people are very, very picky about that. Personally, I'm not very picky about that because I haven't seen the change in clinical efficacy. I do see a little bit of difference depending on the chemistry.
How long can you, how would you, can you give me an example of how you would store an herb from the time you cut the flower? Plant?
Let's see. So sometimes I will take flowers and put them in the fridge for 3 days. When I get to be a week, I feel like that's a little bit too much. If I dry them, if I spread them out, so I don't have an herb dryer, I just spread them out on newspaper or newsprint. You can also hang them. They really should be sealed after they're dried. So if they're dried and loose, they're going to be really susceptible to stuff in the air and the sunlight and things like that. So have you probably seen photographs where there's these herbal, like medieval Renaissance time. I was actually just watching a little show last night about a monk called Catfile during like the 1300s, and he had this little herbal hut. They do definitely, I would say a month would be kind of like a good cutoff point. Now, again, if it's sealed, we have plastic now, they didn't back then, but they still use them. So some of that we don't have records on, and people have opinions about what they've seen. And some of that will depend on, well, if I grew it in my garden and I loved it and this plant is really healthy versus here it is growing and it's not very healthy, it's not going to survive very long. So.
I kind of have the same question. For instance, I have astragalus fruit in a plastic bag from those herbs.
Yeah.
I have it for maybe 2 years. I
I have that too. Yeah.
Still usable? Or?
If it's been out of the sunlight in a place with a reasonable temperature, that's consistent. So temperature changes can also change that. Because I moved my herbal cabinet around. It was a little bit more exposed to sunlight, and then I put them in a place where they're not exposed to sunlight. I have dried and ground nettle leaf powder, and I don't think it's going to be useful, but I want to keep it because it still has iron in it, even though it doesn't have the other compounds. Yeah.
You know, they have those sealing machines now.
Oh, they do.
Super sealers. So, you know, it's not that
Yeah.
I'm going to do this, but if you had an herb you want to keep, like
Theoretically, it is supposed to work. Yeah.
So it keeps the air gone, and then if you just keep it in
Yeah.
a cooler, dark place.
Yeah.
Would
It should last a little bit longer. Yeah.
Is there any way to tell if that's bad? If it's or not usable? I know with spices, I mean, I can compare a new spice of oregano with an old spice of oregano.
Yeah,
See
so-
the difference in smell and the color.
And that's called the organoleptic way of looking at herbs. And they do have a whole book on that. What's the consistency of the powder like? What's it smell like? What's it taste like? And there are herbal product association standards to that. You can also, if you're a herbal product seller and manufacturer, you can run it through HPLC. That's what they actually do for the big companies. It's like, does this actually have what it has? How old is it? It's not good enough. For things like nettle, which are basically very tonifying and safe, you know, I think you could use it as long as it's been in a good storage area, within reason. Elderberry, for example, I have elderberries in my freezer that have been there for months, and I think they're still okay, but they're not as good as if it was a month old, right? Yeah, I'm a little bit of a hoarder, so.
So when these companies make tinctures,
Yeah,
these herbal tinctures,
yeah.
they have to have a standard, don't they? In terms of how soon after they pick it and process it, they can make a tincture?
There are guidelines for the herbal products industry, but not every company follows those guidelines.
So what's a good company?
Wise Woman Herbals puts an expiration date on their products now. They didn't used to, a lot of companies never do. They found through chemistry studies that after so many years, 3 to 5 years, depending on the plant, the constituents degrade over time.
I thought that all retail items had an expiration date.
Sometimes it's the manufacture date, or sometimes it's just like what they think. But Wise Woman has done studies to give a expiration date.
What about not?
I think they do. I don't know. I don't ever use their tinctures, so I can't comment on their tinctures. Some tinctures don't degrade historically. The writings say like phytolacca tincture really shouldn't change over time. That's what a lot of older writings from the 60s said. Now, in opposition, pulsatilla tincture, that's supposed to go bad really fast. You should get rid of that in about 3 years. So it does depend on the botanical as well. Yeah. So in opposition to a tincture, there's a standardized extract. So this is that pharmacy thing I was talking about. So berberine is an alkaloid that's found in golden seal. Now you can buy berberine all by itself. But standardized extracts, sometimes I would have berberine on top of golden seal powder. This is what functional doctors use a lot. I use a lot of these. They have a lot of advantages. They're usually encapsulated if I'm treating like a lab or a disease and not necessarily the individual in front of me. These, if I'm really thinking about expiration dates, this is what I'm going to use, right? These have a lot of analytic requirements to them. And this has also been shown in some of the research. They've looked at expiration of this. But this kind of loses a little bit of that vitality of herbalism. So dosing of all of these depend on the form of the herb that's used. Tea or decoction or a drink. I would also throw in the granules that Chinese medicines use. And they say like twice a day. Sometimes I'll recommend teas 4 times a day, especially for pain. Not all of my patients like teas. I like dosing. Now I'm kind of bad about this. I actually like dosing twice a day for herbs, in the morning and afternoon dinner time, but in reality, they should have a nighttime dose as well. So some of that is based on chemistry, and you want to keep the blood levels up of maybe turmeric and the compounds in turmeric. You want to have that activity overnight. Like if you take a last dose at 5 o'clock and you don't take another dose till 8 o'clock in the morning, there's a whole period where they don't have the action of the botanical in them. You can also dose things, let's say somebody with nausea, you know, they could take 2 milliliters of ginger every couple of hours until they feel better. So there's long-term dosing more for chronic conditions, and short-term that can also be used for antispasmodics like uterine pain and things like that. Capsules and prepared products, they're difficult to dose because some company, this goes back to what you just said, now everything should have an expiration date, but companies make their own formulations and then they become patents and then they can make more money off of them. So it's always a good idea to look at what they recommend and then look at your patient. If your patients overweight with chronic disease, I might go a little bit higher or start low and the next week go up. I do that a lot with patients. I had cannot remember how much he weighed. He was around 230, 250 pounds maybe. Quite tall, 6'1", significant ankylosing spondylitis and pain. So, here, start with these herbs because they're kind of bitter, low for a week, and then bump up. But I also have a lot of people that are very sensitive to botanicals, right? So even just taking 2 drops of a tincture will give them a headache. So identifying those people first can be very helpful, and asking, have you ever taken any herbs before? What does that feel like when you take them? So dosing is the hardest thing about herbs because there's not a standardized process to this. And it takes practice and knowing your patients and knowing the herb. You have to know the two together, I think. Yeah.
I found it really interesting with dosing with CBD oil that's become, everywhere now. And so people are, becoming familiar with this tincture form of medicine that otherwise would have never tried that.
Yeah.
And so they're like, do I take a drop? Do I take a drop or full? It's just so confusing to them.
It's so confusing. So CBD, I found over the years, when CBD first became a little bit more common, the doses were lower, and now that everybody's using it, they've totally bumped up the dose. Like my first CBD bottle was only 2 mgs, and now you can easily go 30. That's huge. Yeah. See, dosing changes with knowledge. Yeah. I do find that most people do better with a higher dose.
Yeah, and most people try to, like, oh, I tried CBD, and they tried a couple drops, and they didn't even get anywhere near the amount of dose they need. So like, oh, it didn't work well.
And that happens with herbs too.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I tend to dose higher. So higher doses twice a day. I'm trying to get away from that. I find twice a day is easy for people to do all the time. So I made this slide just to do a little bit of an overlap. So nutrition, we have amino acids. I mentioned alkaloids. We have proteins, which amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. We don't have anything analogous with botanicals. Carbohydrates are in a lot of roots. So if you ever use slippery elm or marshmallow root, you're using a carbohydrate-rich plant. So lots of soluble fiber and carbohydrates feed the flora, like plant carbohydrates from mushrooms, for example. They're not a plant, but that's okay. They're kind of classified in the herbal world. Mushrooms have been found in the few turkey tail and maitake have increased populations of a specific bifidobacterium that's associated with better health outcomes. So these fats and fatty acids, this list here is what is better in a tincture. Alkaloids can be in a tincture and they're extracted in water. You get more in alcohol, but we drink coffee, or I drink coffee every day, and I definitely get caffeine. So alkaloids can be very, very strong, and they can also be quite sedative, like morphine alkaloids. Carbohydrates are great in water. They're not great in alcohol, but all of these other things are definitely either better as a prepared product or in alcohol. You get a little bit of volatile oils when you're taking teas. I sort of talked about this slide already. What makes things work? There's one point on this slide that I didn't talk about, and that's looking at the plant as a whole as a synergy of all the compounds. It's like you're not just the iron and the bone in your body, it's body, mind, spirit, and you can't really separate that from a human being. So why should we separate that in plants? So the whole plant is going to be better. And there's a little bit of research now that actually says this. So if you're focusing on one compound, I tend to think it's a little bit closer to pharmacology. I probably will go through a couple of these slides very quickly. Volatile oils are amazing. So that holy basil glycerate that was passed around, anything in the mint family, the majority of plants in the mint family, especially if it's used in cooking, thyme, oregano, basil, rosemary, lavender, lemon balm, There's another one that's in this kind of same category. They're all aromatic and they all really work well in a tea because they're all very, very strong and volatile oils.
I have a question specifically about the use of sage, because people burn sage to clear the negative ions in the air. And I've seen sage putting a couple of leaves in tea, and I've done it, and it's very good. What is with sage?
You know, and the thing about sage, some of the sage brush used in smudging is actually not saged in certain parts of the country. It's an artemisia. Yeah, but there is a white sage, it's Salvia alba, that a lot of people use. There was an article published, and I don't know if I read the whole thing, so I apologize, that actually found it does help clean the air when you smudge. But there's also a movement in the herbal world, the traditional herbalists, that were appropriating their culture without giving due respect to it, which I think is really interesting too. So sage is sage. I need a little bit more about what plant they're actually using and where you're using it at, right?
So the sage that you would season a soup or stock.
That's totally different. Yeah, you wouldn't use that for, you could if you wanted to. It's super aromatic, right? That sage is useful to help digestion, so it's carminative. It can help expel gas. That sage is associated with helping to digest fatty meals. That sage is associated with, my word for this is nootropic, so increasing cognitive ability. And then that sage is also associated with decreasing sweating. So those are the uses of that particular sage. And it's yummy, especially for things like that. But sage, there's a Chinese sage, there's clary sage, there's divine sage, which is mildly hallucinogenic, depending on who you talk to. There's at least 200 different sages. I love sages, so yeah. Volatile oils, this is where a lot of people will stay, and I think volatile oils are beautiful in tinctures. Now the thing about tinctures is you're going to get the aromatic compounds, but there's another compound called flavonoids. Flavonoids are bitter. So you can make a tincture of lemon balm, which is Melissa officinalis. Smells amazing. But the flavonoids in lemon balm make the tincture really bitter. So tinctures extract a lot, and that's why a lot of people use essential oils as a product and not necessarily the tinctures, but the tinctures are actually more complete, if that makes sense. And then there's resins, so boswellia, which is also frankincense, is overlapping with that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about alkaloids. I'm just going to kind of gloss over some of this. Nightshade alkaloids. So we have Datura. I do not remember which genus it is. It is not Stramonium. It might be popping up in a couple of leaves by the garden. It's more of a weed right now. It kind of spread, but these flowers, so this is the whole thing about knowing the plant. So Datura, the flowers open in the evening and they're incredibly fragrant. And then they close in the morning. Morning Glory is a different genus, but same type of thing. Morning Glory is a vine. These Daturas are low-growing shrubs. You could kind of call them a shrub. So pharmacology always will talk about the nightshade alkaloids. Yeah.
Are the other genus Datura just as poisonous as the ginseng weed one?
Absolutely. Yep. Daturas point up. They're flowers like this. This one kind of is. There's a related species, which I think is slightly less poisonous, called Bergsmania, and they hang down, but they look exactly the same. Kind of tropical areas, but you could call this moonflower, jimsonweed, devil's apple, thorn apple. I don't have the photograph of the seed pod, which are very spiny. I just love Datura. Belladonna I kind of like, but it's just not as captivating to me. So this is a slide just a little bit on alkaloids and nightshade alkaloids. So I love botanical families. Ashwagandha is a nightshade, goji berry is a nightshade. Some people tolerate nightshades really well. So tomato sauce, if it makes people worse, maybe they don't really tolerate nightshades. Potatoes, eggplant, and then sweet peppers, right? So coffee, of course, has alkaloids and lobelia. So berberine is by far the most popular alkaloid right now, found in Oregon grape and golden seal. So here's some actions. So it's bitter, it's a cholagogue, it's incredibly antimicrobial, and now modern research says this is good for metabolism. I find berberine actually to work well as a capsule or a tablet because it is wickedly, wickedly bitter. And I apologize, I thought I grabbed the golden seal tincture, but Kay might remember tasting the golden seal tincture. Yeah. So I tell this story about a student patient we had years ago who had an abscess, and we gave her berberine for antimicrobial support because it was, I can't remember, I think it was on her arm, it might have been in the axilla, and spreading a little bit. She could not even open the bottle because the smell was so strong it made her nauseous. So this is a place where, you know, research is showing that the herb works, but maybe it's better in this one compound. I believe that this is probably going to be modified in a pharmaceutical in the next 20 years. It is super successful for the most part. So this is the taste receptor I was talking about in the mouth and intestines. And when there's activation of this taste receptor, it induces a hormone class called incretins. Incretins only are secreted when people eat specific things. Number one is glucose, sugars. Like I can't IV glucose and get the incretin response. I have to eat it. But bitter things like berberine, there's some preclinical data in animals that show, oh, it works on this. Binds to the hormone, the taste receptor, and there's signals via the vagus nerve to the incretin glucagon-like peptide 1, and then you have an insulin response. Now that may be the action of why they use it in type 2 diabetes. There's also been modification of labs in PCOS too. I think people can adapt to berberine. I will have to say I've been taking berberine in all of its variety for now 30, I think it's been 30 years now. So as a teenager, I had really bad acne, and it was one of the things that I tried for that, and it was terrible. But I can actually take a lot of berberine now, and it just hardly hits me. So some people may have problems with it. This is tradition and evidence-based, but tradition, this little bullet point here, there's a couple of herbalists that are really picky about this. They say don't use it for infections, and don't use it for blanket infections. You use it for infections where there's discharges, sinusitis, pneumonia, abscesses where there's discharges. If there's no discharge, then something else is more appropriate. So it's a really interesting thing to think about it. Now that's more specific to golden seal, and berberine is found in a bunch of different plants. Aconite also contains alkaloids. I have a couple of slides. I think there's actually a few of these. And I don't think I put this in the slides. Samantha Shore is one of our graduates, and she had done a presentation on this. You all know aconite, and if you don't know it homeopathically, you can watch Harry Potter or read the books because it's in there. This is an aconite that grows at the old McDonald campus in Oak Brook, and I go take pictures of it whenever I remember. So it flowers in September. This is used in very low dose, so the eclectics. Now this is whole root. This is not just the alkaloid. You can use the whole root because a plant part, just like your arm, is bones and bloods and things like that all together. Most plants have a little bit of something that will astringe the alkaloid. Earlier I said that astringent botanicals bind to nitrogenic compounds, and alkaloids contain nitrogen. So that's why you can do a whole plant and have a little bit higher dose. Now, if you're using a tincture, the alkaloids are highly extracted. So it's not quite the same as a whole plant, because the astringent compounds are not as extracted. They are extracted, but not as the rate. So the tincture is diluted, and then if this was used as an herbal in a tincture form, you'd put this in a cup of water. So I would have a 1 to 10 tincture, and then make it in a cup of water, so it creates like almost a 1 to 30 as a whole. And you could use this every so often for pain quite a bit. Eclectic indications also include fever, which is pretty common to think about. The pulse is small and frequent in their writings, but some people actually use this more as a sedative. So a sedative with fever. And then Eastern medicine, this is one of the big powerhouses in TCM. They use this in a much higher dose than homeopathics or Western herbalism. It's called Fuzil. It's king of 100 herbs. It is really, really warm. And when people are in certain stages of, it's hard to identify the clinical Western picture of this. Part of this is serious sequelae, like if I went through how sometimes it's presented in herbal books. Malaria was really common in older times. So tidal fevers, and then part of that is where it's really cold and you could be approaching death. That's when they used aconite. So it warms the interior, and it's like the yin and yang of your body is starting to separate, and the yang, because it's light, it floats away, and all you're left with is being really, really cold. So shock. Now they process this. So they take the roots and they macerate them in water for almost a full day. They make sure that there's no core inside. Then they're boiled in water. And sometimes they're actually sauteed in ginger as well. In Chinese medicine, ginger is a detoxifier. So there's different forms of aconite used in TCM. Some of them are going to be less processed and you use very little, and the ones with maybe less cold will be a little bit more processed. So 3 different processing here. Aconite and pulsatilla are related. So if we're able to go to the garden, what we're going to see are fuzzy leaves. This is used in TCM as well. So in the East, Ba Ta Wang, hoary-headed geezer. So geezer makes me think of wind, and this is called windflower. Has anybody ever seen the seeds of these? I forgot to put the picture in. So all of these little reproductive parts, it looks like all the hair is sticking up and going all over the place, and it looks like hair that's blowing in the wind. It's a very, very hairy plant, and horary in TCM refers to time. But in Western herbal medicine, we would use this similar to the homeopathic. One of our herbal naturopathic greats, Dr. Bill Mitchell, who was one of the co-founders of Bastyr. Now, this is an interesting description because he's not alive anymore to talk about this. Cardiac consciousness. You know, I am overlapping with this. It's like, okay, I have palpitations and I can feel this. This might be part of nervous exhaustion. You know, I'm so tired that my heart's palpitating. Maybe I have iron deficiency anemia as well, but also being aware of sadness, being aware of their anxiety. That could be part of this picture as well. Now, pulsatilla, herbalists disagree on if people are hot or cold. Isn't pulsatilla changeable in homeopathics? And I think that does carry through.
To be hot chronically, but I see it.
Yeah, I tend to use this when there's more hot. I prefer to use pulsatilla in females, and I just add a tiny little bit to a combination tincture. Like I might add 2 milliliters to a 30 ounce, or if it's a 100, milliliter. So in 1 ounce, 30 milliliter, I might just add a couple of mils, or just have them take it by the drop. So if you're taking PRN pulsatilla 30C for an emotional condition, they could take 2 drops of the tincture. So it does overlap. This one I feel overlaps a lot. Now TCM, they use this for bloody dysentery. Using the herbal in any form, whether Western or not, can cause excoriation of the mucous membranes. The eye tends to be the one that is reported the most in eclectic writings. It's a beautiful flower. Yeah.
So the chemical that gives you the blistering and burning of the skin, is that on the actual flower? Is it the stem?
I think it's in the whole plant, and I think it's in almost every plant called pulsatilla, or many plants. And I reviewed this week a couple of times, and then, sorry, I always say this funny, anemone, which is like the sea thing, but anemone is also plants, and pulsatilla and anemone change their names back and forth a lot. Typically, I thought it had changed to anemone vulgaris or anemone pulsatilla. I have seen that a couple of years ago. So every anemone and pulsatilla will have this compound. Yeah. And possibly even black cohosh. I've not seen this in black cohosh. Actea racemosa. This is in the same family. So I did this just to kind of show some linkages here. If you are familiar with black cohosh, it's used a lot for hot flashes, but it's a really good antispasmodic. So it's not exactly always tonifying. It rises up. In Chinese medicine, this is one that rises, and it can create headache. It's also used for prolapse, uterine prolapse, bladder prolapse, supports digestion a little bit, but mostly it's used in combination. This is really worldwide popular, well, Europe and North America as a standardized extract, but we don't know how it works. I will say that. I've studied this a lot. It's changed a lot over the years. We know it tends to be good for hot flashes, but hot flashes are not just estrogen, they're neurotransmitters as well. I put this slide in just to do a little bit of a list for other women's herbs. So red clover and alfalfa and soy are all legumes that contain compounds called isoflavones. Oh, and kudzu too. Flax, schizandra contain compounds called lignans, they bind to the estrogen receptor. And then fennel is a nice carminative for digestion, but it does contain a compound in the essential oil that is estrogenic and has been associated with inducing breast enlargement in young women who take it for, well, actually girls, I think she was 3 years old, take it for colic. So we have some interesting reports. And then I might want to use antispasmodics. Ginger is a great antispasmodic. It's not always the first thing that people think about. And then, so I love botanical families. Aconite, Actea, formerly Cimicifuga. So Cimicifuga, I have this theory that whatever the name was when the remedy was proved is probably the name that's going to stay in homeopathy. Is that true? Yeah, okay.
Even though the name changes botanically, like Russ Tox is not Russ Tox.
I can't remember what it is. Yeah, it is changed. Yeah. So Cimicifuga, now it's Actea, like the pulsatilla has changed. Staphysagria is in this family. Hellebore is in this family. I don't use hellebore as a botanical. There are references to it as a botanical. I know it's a larger homeopathic remedy. Hydrastis does both. That's our golden seal. So I've created little family bits, like pulsatilla is the adolescent girl, hydrastis the middle-aged businessman with a red face, black cohosh is the widowed aunt, aconite is the little baby that cries with a high fever. Oh, staphysagria, of course, is the newlywed young woman, right? And then I have to add to this, black seed probably doesn't have a homeopathic yet, or maybe it does, and I just don't know it. So this is super big in the Middle East. This is like the herb of the Middle East, and it's very important in the Muslim faith. This has got amazing information about it in the medical literature. And students have come up and told me that they take it, they feel better, their skin is improved. It's anti-inflammatory. This is an amazing family, and most of these are very, very strong. So this is a family that if you choose to use this botanically, you have to do a lot of follow-up, even with golden seal and black cohosh. But I bet there's probably 3 or 4 different profound homeopathics in the buttercup family that are really, really common. Now we're going to do some gentle stuff. So just checking in on time because I have a few slides at the end on ginger and turmeric. Do we need a break? Okay. Echinacea. So a beloved Midwestern plant. So echina, maybe echin, refers to spiky. So all echinacea, these reproductive, so they call this a composite flower because this are the disc flowers on the edge, and then the ray flowers are really, really solid. Like once they get dry, they can actually poke you and be a little bit tender. So Echinacea angustifolia is native to this area. All parts of echinaceas are now used, even though Native Americans would use the roots, and they would use angustifolia. There's also an Echinacea pallida. So pallida is a name that says pale, and the flowers are really, really pale, and they're the first ones that bloom in this area. If you're using the roots, and if you're using it in a decoction or water-soluble compound, you're getting those polysaccharides, you're getting the carbohydrates. These carbohydrates are high molecular weight. They don't feed us, we don't absorb them, they feed the flora for one thing, but they also modify the immune system via GALT, the gut-associated lymphatic tissue, and that's what's immune stimulating. Other parts of all echinacea, although those parts are varied, it does depend on the species, contain a compound class acrylamines. It's kind of another mouthful here. These are the compounds that bind to the cannabis receptors. So this specific compound are lipid soluble. They won't be extracted very well in a water preparation, but they're going to be more anti-inflammatory. There is a couple of products on the marketplace. This article came out, I want to say 2006 is when they started talking about echinacea having cannabinergic effects. And now there's at least 2 products geared to anxiety, specifically using this compound. And then this particular echinacea is purpurea. This is the one that's mostly planted. If you, like when I walk down to Jewel or down the street, there's always echinacea down there. Sometimes it's growing in the medium. It's almost always pallida, or excuse me, purpurea, purple. The part above the ground. So I could tincture the flowers and get some of these compounds. These are very large, so the carbon chains here can be 16 to 20 different 20 lengths of carbon. So using echinacea might depend on what you actually want. If I'm using it for immune support, and if I'm just using a decoction, there is a common caution of autoimmune disease. But if I'm using this part, the acrylamines, and I'm using a tincture, that's a less of an issue. So people get confused with that. So I call this immunomodulation. And then you want to think about, well, what are you actually using? So these are 2 echinacea products. I have to look at them to remember what is what over here. One of these is from Gaia Herbs, which is from North Carolina, and one of these is from MediHerb, which is grown in Australia. So I believe this one is the MediHerb product. So it even has the seed, and I don't know anything about the seed. I haven't seen very much here, but it This isobutamides is very similar. It's just a slightly different structure for the acrylamide. So both of these products are geared to anti-inflammatory. However, I'm going to go back to this slide. The majority of people will say echinacea is immune stimulant. So it does depend on the part that's used of some plants. Like ginseng, it might not matter in the future because they're finding the berries in the leaves, but echinacea does seem to matter, and it may or may not matter for some people with autoimmune disease, but when you have a lot of immune stimulation, they can get worse. But when you have more anti-inflammatory effect, they can get better.
I'm hoping I didn't miss something again, but I have a question about cannabinoid receptors and dosing, because I have a lot of patients who smoke a lot.
Yeah.
So do you dose higher, and are you competing, or do you?
I don't know the answer because the dosing is not something I've seen written about very much, especially with echinacea. So I did try to do an update on echinacea and cannabis, cannabinoid receptors in humans, and there's not a lot of new stuff. Those products that are geared to, that are made of echinacea geared to anxiety are actually low dose. The other thing about the cannabis, I started putting some slides in on it, and then I realized it was probably too much, so I'm glad I took it out. The cannabinoid receptors change depending on where you're at. So CBD1 is in the nervous system, and CBD2 tends to be in the immune system. Of course, cannabis is the strongest binding to both of those. Echinacea is the next. The initial reports on echinacea was for CBD2 for the immune system, but there is support for echinacea on CBD1 as well. Maca also binds a little bit to the CBD receptors. Green tea has very little, but it's interesting, and also turmeric does too. Yeah. So I think eventually there'll be a lot of mixtures. Now, if they're smoking, they're not getting it in the GI. So if they're internally taking it, I think there's going to be a different effect because the smoking will be more of that CNS hit. Does that make sense? That's how I interpret it. And I think it's okay to use concomitantly and then just kind of change the oral dosing a little bit depending on outcome. I think so. Yeah. Other immunomodulatory herbs. So modulatory, they're not just immune stimulants. I had the holy basil. Elderberry tends to have an antiviral activity. It's also very yummy. What were we talking about with the water hemlock? American ginseng is milder than Asian ginseng. I tend to think these ginsengs, I do this family thing, so they're both Panax quinquefolius and Panax ginseng, and Panax ginseng is the male and quinquefolius is the female. They're brother and sister. Because Panax quinquefolius American ginseng is more yin and TCM. Astragalus, which is a nice yummy herb, is that the one you said you had, Lisa? I think astragalus is a little bit more carbohydrate dense, and as long as the carbohydrates don't get eaten by little bugs, I think they're okay. But remember, how often do you replace flours if you cook a lot, right? Like, how many of you bake? Anybody bake in here? Anybody have flour in your house? Some people might not have flour in their house anymore. You know, how often do you just throw out a bag? Yeah, some people do. Yes, see, it's the same kind of thing that flour would have. Mushrooms. Cannot talk about mushrooms enough, but I left it kind of small in here. Shiitake, maitake, reishi, and turkey tail all have some really nice reports. They're all a little bit different. Reishi has less, well, shiitake and maitake and turkey tail have some of the same polysaccharides that echinacea might have. Reishi has a little bit more like licorice, which I think is our next botanical. Reishi is thought to have more systems it can treat. In Chinese medicine, they use reishi, called lingzhu, to treat heart and to treat the spirit. But in Western medicine, I can't really find anything significant, which is unfortunate because I think it really does have that effect.
Did you throw cordyceps up there as well?
You know, I thought about that and I didn't, because cordyceps, I don't think as immune modulating, because I think its target tissues are the kidney. Yeah. And some would say urinary genitals for men. So cordyceps is the little fungus that infects bugs. If you've ever seen or heard about, some people call it the zombie fungus. So we have various cordyceps and they infect different organisms. In Southeast Asia, I get the two countries mixed up. So it's more common in Burma and Tibet and another country. And one country has more money and is growing it in a container. But the other country doesn't have funding for it, so it's being over harvested. But it's so popular because it is considered a variety of herbal Viagra. So the other male component to it. Yeah, I think cordyceps a little bit different. Let's see. So I meant to modify this slide. And let's see. Oh, we can start here. This slide is a photograph of the licorice from the garden that's not above the ground yet. Licorice is significantly hormonally active by its compounds. So when I was talking about physiology and enzymes, this is the one where we have a lot of documentation that it can interact with. By my calculation, there are at least 5 different enzymes that work on reproductive hormones, and then one specific, well, 2 for cortisol, and that's glycyrrhizin. Glycyrrhizin is the sweet compound, and the flavonoids are a little bit bitter. So it's kind of like a bittersweet, but it's also a little demulcent. So I keep on forgetting my samples here, but I have a solid extract of licorice and a funky spoon. So I've touched this part of it. It could potentially get a little messy if you want. You could dip and then drop. So this is the consistency of molasses. And it should have some glycerin. It may have some honey. If you want to pour, feel free. Glycerin solid extract is very sweet, but also a little bit bitter. So this is one that's 4 to 1 in that weird ratio compound. It is ubiquitous in TCM. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Just kind of dole it out there. It's used as a harmonizer. So there's a lot of formulas where they just use like 3 pieces of licorice. Yeah. Or we can leave it open and you can try it at the end. Yeah, it's super sweet. It's got a comfortable quality to it. In Chinese medicine, it supports digestion. It's got some spleen qi tonification. It's got a nice demulcent activity in Western medicine. In Ayurvedic medicine, again, because I have a hard time following all of the actions here, most of the formulas from India that are sold in the US are for respiratory conditions. Because licorice tastes really good, it's suitable for children for respiratory conditions. Like they can just suck on a piece of licorice root, which is a really nice way to take it, just by licorice root, which unfortunately I'm all out of the licorice roots. So this is the modification of the slide that I was trying to do. So glycyrrhizin, very sweet. Phytoestrogens, flavonoids, which are a little bit bitter, and it's a classic adaptogen. It's anti-inflammatory. It's got a nice but mild laxative effect. Thank you. It may also lower testosterone. So young men who might be taking this for energy as an adaptogen might actually not be benefiting their sperm production. I just think that's important to note. Not everybody's going to have the same reaction to this. I think a lot of people are aware of its hypertensive effects. So this is a graphic that I really like from an article published a few years ago. Every Christmas, there's an article, often on Medscape, if you follow Medscape, about how licorice is bad for you, right? So licorice sold in America, there's like only 1 or 2 brands that you have to go to the health store to get that contain licorice. Licorice is flavored with aniseed, not licorice. But in Europe, it is licorice. So glycyrrhizin works on 2 different enzymes. Now, it's well known to inhibit this, so 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So cortisol is broken down into cortisone, and licorice stops that. So you have more cortisol, but it also affects aldosterone. So the net effect is that there's more binding to the mineralocorticoid receptor, and then the electrolytes change. So I think when some people jump in that licorice is bad for blood pressure, you might think it acts on the heart. It doesn't act on the heart, it acts on the electrolytes. That's kind of easy to identify who's going to have a problem with it. Are they having more water retention? So if people start licorice and they feel like I feel heavier or puffier, maybe they're having an adverse reaction. These are not common. They're not common with the tincture. They're not common with the whole root. They're not common with TCM preparations. This is more common when they standardize glycyrrhizin. So this compound that's super sweet that everybody might want to eat. It's also more common in middle-aged people with metabolic issues already, but especially females. So females don't always focus on heart issues. Like females experience heart attacks very different than males. It's not as painful. So it's just something to keep an eye out. Current indications for licorice, because it can potentially lower testosterone, women with hirsutism from PCOS. A lot of people are using it for this. I personally don't like to use it because then you have more estrogen. But some people find success. Are they using it in clinic right now? Kay, do you know? Yeah, they have in the past. People that like licorice love it and it works really well, and there's few that don't like it. It might take them a long time to see that. But cortisol support, so if it's like an Addison's disease type of picture, this increases cortisol. If somebody already has increased cortisol, it's still going to increase it. There's not a loop that licorice can change because it's that one enzyme. But where licorice has great support, even medical doctors have to agree that the demulcent, slippery quality, and it also increases mucus production by certain cells, especially of the respiratory tract, but also the GI tract. So mouth ulcers is an indication to use glycyrrhiza. Vata types could possibly appropriately use this. So in my opinion, I think it's better to start lower and work your way up just to see. Solid extract is what we were just passing around. All right, so we're at the end where all we have now is turmeric and ginger. So I found this slide that I used a few years ago and I love it. So just imagine that you're in a tropical region where they have curcuma growing in the coconut groves. So curcuma growing, this photograph was taken at a co-op in Carbondale, Illinois, so southern Illinois. If you've ever gone down there, great forest, and they were selling organically grown turmeric, so I bought a whole bunch. It wasn't the strongest, but it was still really nice. Turmeric has a slight bitter quality. It has essential oils in it, so it also has carminative quality. It's very supportive to the liver, so hepatoprotective, liver protective. Older research supports cardiovascular action, including lowering lipids. I will have to say I have not seen this lower lipids in my patients. Now I use a lot just curcumin, which I think the next slide has. I'm starting to go back to using the whole herb, but curcumin, the class, it's like a group of compounds. I don't think it works quite so much for cardiac stuff. I think it works really nice for the GI system and as an anti-inflammatory though. Yeah.
What do you think about the whole, you need black pepper to absorb?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
I think it's in here. So I threw in some other pictures. In Chinese medicine, they use a lot of different curcumas, and turmeric, the one that we use, is the least often used. In our TCM clinic, we have a 70-something Asian professor, Dr. Chai. She uses Euzhou, and sometimes Yujin. Yujin has a spiritual component, settling the mind. But these invigorate blood, so they can theoretically contribute to blood flow and theoretically interact with any anticoagulant. That's only theoretical. That's 2 articles that have been published in the last 5 years have not seen that effect. You always have to be cautious, but in reality, none of these should interact with an anticoagulant. Little bit on Ayurvedic medicine. Ayurvedic medicine uses different ones as well. Of course, this is sort of, some people call holy basil the queen in Ayurvedic medicine, and now this is kind of the modern king, but I do think there's other botanicals that have had more importance over the years. But this is used in ceremony. So this orange color, you can buy and just use it in a particular ceremony that I haven't actually seen in great detail, but I know it's quite popular. So this was described by Dioscorides. What was that, 40 to 80 BC, used in the Middle Ages, but not super common. So it's a coloring agent for the most part. So curcumin is a class of 6 to 10 different compounds. Over the years, there's been more curcuminoids discovered, and curcumilonga curcuminoids are significantly anti-inflammatory. This myeloperoxidase is associated with inflammation in the vessels, and we know COX inhibition, cyclooxygenase enzyme, is associated with anti-inflammatory activity as well. I wanted to add a couple of things about turmeric, not often talked about, and there's a couple of more studies on this. I only included one. Some people will have an antidepressant effect from turmeric. It's not really part of the tradition, like an herb for one thing. Modulates serotonin, norepi, and dopamine. So serotonin has its own pathway, but epi and norepi and a little bit of dopamine are actually modulated and degraded by this enzyme catechol-methyltransferase. The only problem with using turmeric, and some students have actually shared in class, that curcuma makes them worse because it increases their enzymes. Excuse me, I'm going to start all over again. Turmeric makes them worse because it increases the neurotransmitters, and then they have a decreased activity of this enzyme, so they have more neurotransmitters making them anxious. So did I repeat that correctly? Does that make sense? So this COMT enzyme is something that pops up on 23andMe, although I've heard recently that they're starting to take that out. But Ancestry.com, if you ever do your assessment with that, that will show up. You just have to run it through a specific website to find it. There's a lot of COMT polymorphisms in my family. I think it's something interesting to note about turmeric. Oh, I feel worse, but my body feels like it has less pain. Then you want to modify and tweak these a little bit. But people might take turmeric and then feel worse with anxiety, and that might be a significant issue. And that's not going to be good. This is not super common in my practice. I see some people with this enzyme polymorphism that like the physical effect they get, and they just need to relax a little bit more. So as clinicians, that might be an approach that you take, because this is super popular. People are making all kinds of things with turmeric right now. And this is one of the studies, so 2014, and they compared it to Prozac. So I'm not going to read through this. It was equally effective, but had less side effects. So the majority of botanicals that have been compared side to side with a pharmaceutical will be either equal or a little bit less, but the side effects are significantly less. That's just something that has been more common over the years. So people might say, oh, it's not as good as the drug, but it is actually, because people will be better. So this BMC turmeric, here we go, is part of a standardization fraction. So curcuma longa root needs a lipid. So if I put turmeric root in coconut milk, that's going to be better. If I add a little bit of black pepper, that could be better too. Traditionally, it was used with black pepper. Supplements are using this extract of black pepper that's an alkaloid. Now, this alkaloid from black pepper, so I have a colleague that's in Michigan, and we were talking about this several years ago. She treats cancer patients with a lot of botanicals. This piperine just rips apart the intestines. It irritates the mucous membranes of the intestines. Now, black pepper, again, it's the whole herb. It's not this alkaloid, so a little bit of black pepper is very different. But ginger possibly can do the same thing. So if you're making golden milk, you add ginger. Yeah, I like a little bit of cinnamon, maybe some cardamom, and just a little bit of black pepper. I've only made it a couple of times though. Yeah.
Do you have a formula for golden milk?
I don't. I just look online and then I wing it. I'm really bad with
There's also
writing.
recipes for chia seeds and making turmeric as a pudding.
Yeah, chia seeds puddings, I like that. If you like turmeric, definitely make a chia seed pudding. You can add it to a smoothie. It is a little bitter. So let's see. So dried curcuma will not necessarily be absorbed. So this should say lecithin, coconut milk, cream, cow dairy cream, and ghee, sorry, ghee. So of course I think ghee is a little bit better. Tincture, so up to ½ an ounce, so 5 milliliters is a decent dose. So divided doses over time. Now, curcumin, if you're buying that as a product, that's when they enhance it with the black pepper piperine. Bromelain can help absorption, but only if you take it away from food. Ginger can help absorption, in my opinion, and a little bit of clinical experience, even when you take it with food. I think curcuma should be taken with food because that's how it was used traditionally, with food. So this whole thing about bromelain, I think that's poor compliance and possibly poor outcomes. So lecithin is pretty good. Now, this particular, I stole this straight. This came out last week in my email newsletters. BCM 95 is not sold in the US under Curcu Green. It's sold in the US from a company called Euromedica. And they have different blends. They blend it with boswellia and they blend it with phenylalanine, the amino acid phenylalanine. It's kind of hard to find in the US by itself. I'm assuming now that they've been given a patent. So this company that makes the Curcu Green is from India, and they probably distribute it all over the world. So eventually these BCM. So anyway, and I didn't really allude to this earlier. So fresh root contains the orange compounds, curcuminoids, and essential oils. So this BCM 95 adds the essential oils back in at a higher amount. So it bypasses the black pepper because it's closer but higher amount to the whole herb. So it's kind of like the whole herb on steroids, basically. This has got a lot of studies behind it. I would like to use this a little bit more. I haven't had a chance to for the most part. I tend to use ones on this page. So if you're just taking curcumin, you can take different milligrams. BCM 95 is kind of a complex of 3 different curcuminoids with compounds from the essential oils. I think you can now find it, especially on the internet. I will have to say I look mostly at fruitful yield when I'm looking at BCM 95, or conferences sometimes have it. I like to call this particular form of curcumin nanoparticulated. Makes it feel like high tech. It makes it water soluble, so it is more absorbed. Some clinicians have said if you're using that form of the nanoparticulated, you need more of it. So Euromedica is the company that sells this. Terry's Nutrition Naturally is a retail brand of this. Integrative Therapeutics, and this is Theracurmin. Yep. I think it's really well tolerated, a lot. And then Mariva, which is a product that was only sold by Thorne for many years, is bound to lecithin, and the other name for lecithin is phosphatidylcholine. I've seen success with all of these. I haven't used the solo BCM 95 very much, but I will in the future.
So what would you say is the best way to prepare the fresh fruit? Raw, grated, smoothie, cook it?
I like to cook it. Yeah, and I like golden milk, and I like adding the dried powder. So like a, I haven't used a lot of this brand. This is curcumin with coconut powder. I don't think that's right, actually. CoQ10 and medium chain triglycerides. So spoon, this is from a company called IMHA Herbs. Yeah. I'm assuming they still sell it. It's not something I've seen on their website very much. I actually really like the tincture of this though. I use the tincture if I'm using it alone with patients, but I also use this in combination formulas. So the BCM 95 is not in my favorite combination formulas. My favorite combination formula is a product called, actually, one of my favorites is made by them. It's named for Boswellia, which is frankincense, but it's Boswellia, ginger, ashwagandha, and curcumin. That's actually what I'm taking right now. It's not available retail very much, so I tend not to use it with patients. It's not on my online dispensary company either. I use it's a Designs for Health product that I sometimes use.
So you don't think that it needs to be cooked to be absorbed? I heard that.
I think you should have it with fat.
So if you have fat,
That's, yeah. And that goes back to tradition.
But if you use a plant, it's got the lipids in it.
Yeah.
So if you grind up the plant, you're getting the lipids.
Yeah.
So it has to be cooked.
I don't think it has to be cooked.
Like if you
No.
do fresh
I mean-
squeezed turmeric, you know,
Yeah.
a juicer.
Yeah.
root, that'd be fine, right?
In general, I don't recommend juicing because you do lose constituents because they're bound to the fiber. Yeah, because you're just gonna get mostly the carbohydrates in the roots. I actually think juicing turmeric is not sustainable. I think you end up with a lot of waste. I think juicing a lot of herbs is like that.
Blending it.
What was that?
Blending.
I think blending it is awesome. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so if you're using the whole powder of turmeric or a whole fresh fruit, you should be fine. People go and they just take curcuminoids, or like this type 1 here, and they're not getting as much effect. That's when they need the fat, absolutely. That's when they might opt for that black pepper stuff. Yeah, really should be taken with food, and we really should have a little bit of fat at most meals. You know, it doesn't have to be the full-on keto or high animal. Coconut, avocado, there's lots of really good stuff there.
Why does it black pepper? Does it have the oils or it has something else in it?
It works on, I do not remember the little transporter. It does work on a transporter, but it also, by excoriating some of the mucous membranes.
So it's irritant effect allows it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Cause
kind
a
of,
little leaky gut or.
yeah, but it does, it's like a, they call it an ABC thing. Something binding cassette. It's not coming to me, and I don't know it
But it
very well
increases
either.
absorption, but it doesn't have to do with oil. It's a
No.
separate, totally separate effect.
Yeah, the black pepper, it's the alkaloid specifically. Yeah, yeah. Do you remember something?
And it's interesting that black pepper has beta-caryophyllene, which
Yes,
also
yeah,
reacts with
that's the one
CB2 receptors.
I was forgetting. I was trying to remember that part. So the beta-caryophyllene is
Yeah.
found in a lot of essential oils, and
Yeah.
black pepper is really aromatic. That's why I don't know why they're using piperine and the alkaloid alone, and if they use the whole plant, which is what India did probably for centuries, right? Right. So less slides on ginger. Ginger doesn't have the same kind of trendiness that curcuma does. I think it should. So curcuma and ginger are cousins, whereas American ginseng and Asian ginseng are brother and sister. Curcuma longa is turmeric. Zingiber officinalis is ginger. I don't know why I don't have this on that page, sorry. And they're in the same family. They're in the ginger family. The family's name for ginger. Both of these are roots or rhizomes. Both of these have carminative. Both of these have significant essential oils. Ginger, of course, is very spicy and can be diaphoretic. It is the most reliable diaphoretic I have ever used, both personally and with patients. They're using ginger now for infections. There's actually been a clinical intervention trial for this. I don't think about ginger for coughs, but it is something that's popped up. But ginger is well known to be antiemetic. So motion sickness, morning sickness. My only concern with using ginger for digestion in certain people, like sometimes people that were overweight that have digestive issues actually have a hiatal hernia and they don't really know it. And because the ginger gets stuck in that herniation, it can make their heartburn a little bit worse. Yeah, it's not common. It's just one of those weird things. Ginger is thought to make the whole GI system from the stomach down work a little bit more quickly. The prokinetic pharmaceutical, I think that's called Reglan, used for constipation. Yeah. Ginger is incredibly anti-inflammatory. It actually works on many of the same mechanisms that turmeric does. Yeah.
What about if somebody has Helicobacter?
Oh, I haven't seen that. That's a great question. I would consider using it. Yeah.
That would work better.
No, I don't. For Helicobacter pylori, golden seal is thought to be appropriate. Yeah. But I would consider ginger. Yeah, I don't know if that's been studied, and I don't know if anybody does that. I haven't seen anything about that, but I haven't looked recently. So ginger is great to cook with. You should definitely cook with it. One of our faculty members brought ginger into her class many years ago, and students didn't even know what it looked like, which I think is very, very sad. This is probably one of the easiest herbs to use. So way back in the early part of the after death or current era, Dioscorides reported mixing it with antidotes for poisonings. So it does have this really interesting use, and it's considered very hot. I didn't mention Galen earlier, but black pepper's the hottest, and I think ginger's probably better tolerated. It doesn't irritate the lining of the intestines, and I think it actually has a lot of healing quality to it. So ginger has gingerols, which are part of the essential oil. These shalgos develop after the plant has dried. So I think ginger is different, whether it's fresh or dried. I like to make ginger fresh tinctures here. I think this ginger is the best folk method tincture you could make because it's fairly effective, it's fairly strong. So let's see. The label is not accurate. but this is dried ginger tincture. So dried is stronger than fresh. Dried's going to be better for anti-inflammatory. However, I think fresh is better for GI issues, especially for pregnancy. Lots of fun stuff about ginger. As I had mentioned before, possibly for infections, coughs. This is my weakness. I hardly ever think about ginger for infections. I definitely think about ginger for metabolic issues. It's actually got a nice protective effect, even though it's kind of pungent. It's safer than black pepper. It will still help curcuma absorption, and it's yummy. So nausea and vomiting is probably the oldest indication and well known. A couple of studies that have come out since 2014. I was in correspondence with one of the authors. These studies were done in the Middle East in young women with dysmenorrhea and heavy menstrual bleeding. They were all younger than 25. Ginger is one of the ones that is thought to interfere and make anticoagulants work more. You're not supposed to use them together because there could be more increased bleeding. So it's always been more caution to use with women who have heavy menstrual bleeding. But this study in young women found that it actually decreased their bleeding. So, you know, you could think, are they bleeding because they're having a coagulation issue, or are they bleeding because they have an inflammatory disorder somewhere in the endometrial lining? Last time I was working in the clinic many years ago, we had a bunch of samples, and there was a student who had acute menstrual pain. These were integrative therapeutic samples, and so I said, here, take this curcuma and this ginger, curcuma Pro and ginger max, I think is what they were. And within 2 days, she came in and said that worked like magic. So ginger should really replace the black pepper here, or you could try ginger alone. I almost always have ginger in my house, and I almost think this should be something that everybody has in their house. Some people don't like ginger, just like some people actually don't like the taste of licorice. You know, I think that's good. I think you can acclimate yourself. I encourage patients to just have little bits at a time. Yeah.
What about the nice dry ginger?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Acclimating with ginger.
Nausea, motion sickness.
Yeah, I think I think it's great. I also think it's an interesting way to get people used to the flavor. Yeah. Yeah, I brought my ginger candies to work the other day. That's why I didn't have them to bring from home this morning. Yeah, they're easy to tolerate. You can spit them out if you don't like to. They're cheap. They're now available everywhere. They're covered in sugar if you get the dried one, so you kind of have to dust off the sugar. So ginger increases absorption. It's not as significant or irritating as black pepper. I think I've said that a couple of times. Sorry for repeating myself. The dried herb is stronger. So in Chinese medicine, they take 10 grams of the dried herb for some things. The fresh herb is weaker, but I think it's a little bit safer in pregnancy. However, a study showed in England, I think, and this was over 1,000 women with morning sickness. Women can take 1.5 grams of dried ginger powder and they're fine. I usually recommend 300 milligrams 3 times a day though. So looser, standardized really should be for inflammatory metabolic disorders without pregnancy, I think, because the Schalgals, and some companies will say Schalgals on the label, the Schalgals are definitely stronger in that regard. And a little bit of a table comparing the two. So ginger's pungent and many people like the flavor. Turmeric is not quite as bitter. The curcumin is definitely bitter. Turmeric has some liver and gallbladder effect, and ginger's a little bit more GI. Some adverse reaction, drug for just a general term I use for all compounds. I do think that the retrosternal burn is probably more common in a hiatal hernia now that I've actually had some people report retrosternal burning, find that they have a hiatal hernia. So both are anti-inflammatory. Neurologic, the antidepressive effect from turmeric, whereas ginger has a little bit more gynecological support. The metabolic support, I think we can overlap that both for cancer. Turmeric has at least 2 studies for colon cancer. I am not aware of any human intervention studies with ginger in cancer, but you know, I miss a lot of things with trying to keep up with the literature. But these 2 can work together to increase absorption. And that's all I have. Thank you for some of you that sat the whole time. So here's my email. It's just my last name at nuhs.edu. I may not answer questions quickly, but I love looking questions up if I don't know the answer. I have students send me emails all the time. There's a whole slew of botanicals. You know, I just chose these ones because they're popular. And I did kind of want to do the aconite buttercup family thing. It's my little, I love the buttercup family. We could go look at our pulsatilla. It's not in flower if you didn't hear that already. It's not flowering, but those of you who are visiting campus often can go visit it and you can see it. And maybe we can pick some of the leaves and actually test it to see if it's caustic. I do not have any scissors with me. But before I finish, the book that I didn't pull up, this is a really cheap, it's kind of old now. David Hoffman is a British herbalist. He has a variation of the book. This book, it goes back to the 80s. But you can find this used for 30 bucks. It retails for 60. It has a whole slew on chemistry. It's very British, so it doesn't have the up-to-date stuff on curcumin and ginger. But it's kind of nice. So like for students learning formulations, like here's a page with just the structures. If I flip back. So here's a formula. Let's see. And then there's got some nice tables. I think it's a really good basic book, and I like it because it's affordable and fairly easy to read. It's not like high tech. And I like it. Any questions? You ready to go get a little bit of sunshine?
We're ready in 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Oh, and I have pieces of ginger. I forgot that I did grade these. So if you want to suck on a piece of ginger on the way. They're little. So I think I'll grab a piece of paper towel if we take a little piece of the pulsatilla off and kind of snip it.
You want to look at the book?
I wrote it down.
This is the first. I don't think I've ever seen it. You probably have it, right? Maybe.
Can we leave our stuff here for a few minutes while we walk over? Thank you. Oh, yeah. So the eclectic writings are all free online. So you can, Henrietta's Herbs, she's an herbalist from Finland. And she has almost all the eclectic writings, and it's mostly, she didn't upload the minerals and stuff like that in the drugs. But you can look up a book by its author or title, and it just lists what herbs are in there.
Is it online versus?
Yeah, yeah, because these are now, because there's only a couple of them. Yeah, this publisher doesn't print them very much. I don't think they're super expensive. This was over $100. I bought it. You can't find these used sometimes, so I usually have students look online. It's a little easier. Henrietta. Henriette's Herbs, Finland.
But her herbs, she's one of the largest and oldest herb sites on the internet. Yeah, she has a couple of books herself.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to?
Okay.
I'm gonna put this in.
All right.
Anybody want a piece of ginger? They're actually quite yummy.
Okay, I got something great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll try it. I forget how long, so this ginger is at least 3 years old. And it might even be like. You're welcome. I love talking about her. And it's kind of a weird day for me to show.
420.
Finals.
Yeah,
I was like, you're not celebrating?
I'm here to celebrate. Oh, thank you. Are we done today?
I have a quick one if anybody wants to
Okay.
stay. And if nobody's really, we can do it next time.
All right.
I want to put this on. Andre's saying in October, it's already on the IMHA website. So
I might have sent you the thing, I don't know, but if not, let me know and send me an email. You've got my email, right?
Yeah, I'll send you an email reminding you.
Yeah, he's gonna come in October.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Which day?
If I get my phone, my peripheral brain, I'll tell you exactly the date.
You say peripheral brain?
My peripheral brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one weekend I was gonna go to Atlanta.
My birthday's October.
Or Scorpio.
Are you a Scorpio? Oh, thank you.
Well, Libra Scorpio cusp, technically October 23rd.
Nice.
All over the place.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I was like, I don't have a DVD player.
Another appointment, yeah.
Oh,
Sorry. Yeah.
Unless
It's
it's.
so intense. Right.
Want to go out to lunch? Bipolar for lunch.
From a meditation retreat, which I thought was really like too bad. That's, I think, rare, you know, but just like with anything, powerful. I was surprised to hear that. I said, it was amazing for me. I've done 10 days with Boston. I was on silent meditation. Kate did one as well. And Alex Orton did one as well. After I told him. Got a lot of.
I know, man. Probably it was on your head, right?
Right.
Yeah.
First diagnosed, yeah, so.
I wonder if they were on meds.
Well, I wanted to thank you very much.
There's so many there, yeah, there.
Thank
Probably
you.
able to do it.
Oh, good. Well, have a good holiday. Whatever you're doing. Yeah. Thank you. And the students, they don't realize they miss you, but yeah, there was a second trimester she just got, and she's super excited about it, so I'll have to remind her next time I see her.
Yeah. The Balmo network is the same type.
Right, which is more of that.
Right.
The mind wanders, more the tap positive. Change it, I like it.
Wow.
So still
Is
something.
that the one? Which
Yeah.
one do you
It's
Not transcendental meditation, right?
it's like,
Like,
you know,
Right, I was just telling him that I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
Which one is it gonna be like?
right,
Anyway, have a good rest of the
in
day.
Naperville.
Thank you, Dr. Sorensen.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Dr. Krebs.
I've seen that place, I've been curious about it.
Yeah.
No. Okay, awesome. Yeah.
But there's ways around paying when you're students. When they
So Dr. Sorensen, do you want to join us for lunch? We're going out to lunch and discussing homeopathy.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting ready for the week. Well,
Yeah.
it kind of feels like this is the beginning of my weekend, because I still actually have some reading to do, and I might keep a couple people but that's Monday, but the hard part is done, so I feel like the trimester's ending with today.
I did it before I started
I-
skiing here.
And then I stop, of course, for tomorrow, so.
Yeah. That's what I
If I could get home.
You do lunch.
Well, have a good lunch, and,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
See you.
Have a good night.
Thanks.
So where do you want to go? The Greek
It's
place,
just us.
the Indian place?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was like, I don't want to.
They're all good. They're all,
Oh, Greek islands?
Greek houses were good.
Greek islands.
Vegetarian. or-
Indian is good.
Indian.
We can walk there, doesn't make sense.
Either one of those sounds great to me. I love all
What do you want, sir?
What do you want to do?
of. I love India. I was crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, the buffet. Yeah, it's a
I
great.
haven't done it in a while.
Lunch.
Yep,
Yeah.
right here. Yeah.
Hey, Tim, how do I get my little thingy out of here? Do I hit the black, the red thing?
Oh, that's wrong. Walking now.
So,
She took the whole time.
isn't that great?
She's like encyclopedia. Oh,
I mean,
I'm very
I
impressed.
just knew that that would be a good person to ask.
Good for
And
you,
Kay was the one that was able to hook me up with her and get introduced her so we could ask her. Isn't that great? And the next month is Christine Chambro.